Amid the thin morning mist of Fern Hollow, a deliveryman stumbled upon a trembling kitten, her breath faint and shallow. But what no one expected was the response from Shire, an old German shepherd who had been lying silently for days. When their eyes met, something shifted. Shire gently curled his body around the kitten, and in that very moment, her tiny cries fell silent. So what happened when that fragile heart suddenly stopped beating? Fern Hollow greeted the first morning of the rainy season with a thin veil of mist hovering just above the ground, as if dreams had yet to dissolve into the daylight. Along the gravel road, skirting the northern edge of the forest, dried maple leaves floated quietly in small streams left behind by the night's rain. No one would have imagined that in such a tranquil place, over 10 kilometers from the nearest home, someone, or something, was calling out with the faintest, most fragile, yet most urgent voice imaginable. Marvin Kells, the only deliveryman still servicing the mountain route in early mornings, hadn't planned on stopping until he heard it. A faint cry, almost swallowed by the wind, but just enough to make anyone who had ever loved an animal feel their chest tighten. He turned off the engine, rolled down the window, and listened. Again, the sound returned. Not loud, not lingering, just a single pulse slipping through the pine trees, yet it stirred the chilled forest air in an undeniable way. He stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, feeling as though he had wandered into a long-lost memory. Moving carefully, he approached a patch of grass beside a narrow ditch, where rainwater had pooled into a small, glassy mirror reflecting the silver-gray sky above. And there, beneath a mess of tangled grass and a decaying maple leaf, lay a life so small it could have been mistaken for a clump of wet debris. But its eyes, wide with wonder, confusion, and exhaustion, stared directly into Marvin's. It wasn't a gaze of pleading, nor one of blame. It was the look of a creature trying to exist, even when everything around it had already given up. The kitten was soaked through, trembling all over, its belly sunken from days without food. But what stopped Marvin wasn't its pitiful appearance. It was the sound it kept making. Not a wail of pain, not a whimper of fear, just a small, rhythmic cry, steady and persistent, as if it still believed that if it kept calling, someone would come. That if it kept shivering, somewhere out there, warmth might still be waiting. Marvin had no towel, no carrier box. He took off his outer coat, knelt down, and gently slid his hands beneath the kitten's frail body. It was so light, he could have sworn it floated with the wind. As he held it close to his chest, for the first time that morning, he felt a faint breath against his shirt, weak, uneven, but unmistakably alive. He named her on the drive back, Luna, because her eyes, when they looked up at him, reminded him of the moon cresting over the mountains in the dead of night. The Fern Hollow Animal Rescue sat quietly on a low hillside, ringed by old honeysuckle trees. The main building was whitewashed, with a weathered dark wood roof, aged but clean. When Marvin stepped inside, holding Luna wrapped in his crumpled coat, everything seemed to pause for a few seconds. A young volunteer named Pia rushed forward, then stopped short. Not out of fear, but because something in Marvin's eyes told her this wasn't an ordinary case. After drying, warming, and a quick health check, they placed Luna in a cotton-lined basket beside the heater. Her body temperature was still lower than normal, but not in the danger zone. The strange thing was, she kept crying, not screaming, not reacting to pain, just that same small cry, one after another, as if she'd been programmed to send out a rescue signal until there was no breath left to give. "Could be stress," Pia whispered, "or maybe she was hungry too long." But Marvin shook his head. He'd heard kittens cry before, this was different. An hour later, once things had settled, they brought Luna into the common area, where recovering animals waited for adoption or rested in silence. Nearby, beneath a small window, lay a large dog, unmoving. His coat was a dark, dusty brown, with some patches faded like old scars. His ears stood, but he didn't react to the sounds around him. And his eyes? They followed no one. That was Shire, a retired German shepherd once part of the mountain rescue team. They said during a flash flood years ago, Shire lost track of the final victim, and though he survived, he never again responded to voices or commands the same way. But today, something shifted. Shire raised his head, not suddenly, not fast, but with purpose. As Pia gently set Luna's basket on the warm tile floor, the dog rose, each step slow and deliberate, like a long-sleeping sentinel waking from his post. No one said a word. No one stopped him. Shire lowered his head and looked into the basket. Luna gazed back. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Pia froze mid-motion. Marvin clutched the edge of his coat. A gentle touch, just the tip of Shire's nose brushing against Luna's forehead, like a silent test. And then, without warning, Shire lay down, curling his large body around the small basket. There was no growl, no bark, no warning, just one large form encircling a fragile one, like a wordless vow. If anyone wants to come near her, they'll have to go through me first. And in that very moment, for the first time since being found, Luna stopped crying. Luna hadn't slept at all that morning. Though she had been wrapped in a soft fleece blanket, placed under a warm orange heat lamp, and fed 2 small servings of diluted milk through Pia's careful droppers, the tiny kitten continued to cry in intervals. It wasn't from cold, nor hunger. It was something more instinctual, like a reflex wired into her body, as if stopping might mean being forgotten all over again. Each sound from her thin throat came out the same, fragile, faint, yet carrying a tone unlike any other, a mixture of plea, memory, and a strange kind of pulse, as if she were waiting for a signal she herself didn't understand, unsure who, if anyone, might be on the other end. Pia had placed a small bell near Luna's basket to track movement. She sat beside it, observing silently for nearly an hour. At times, Luna seemed to doze off, only for her ear to twitch slightly, and that cry to echo once again. Never loud, but impossible to ignore. "What are you searching for, little one?" Pia whispered, not expecting a response, but asking anyway, as though saying it aloud might help her grasp something still unseen. In the distance, past the rows of wooden kennels separated by frosted glass, elderly cats slept curled in corners. A 3-legged beagle chewed quietly on a frayed toy. Upstairs, the metal enclosures for large dogs sat empty after last week's rescue deployment. The main room was so still that the sound of Luna's breathing and Pia's soft footsteps became the only things tethering the space to life. At Fern Hollow, people had learned to listen with their ears, not just to noise, but to need. The rescue center wasn't large, but it was warm. Built from a repurposed workshop, the space had been transformed into clear, functional zones. The first floor housed intake, vet services, and a shared living area. The second floor was for animals needing isolation. On the living room wall hung dozens of photos, animals who had been saved, adopted, or passed on, each with a small wooden plaque etched with a name and date of departure. Beneath that wall stood a wooden desk, where Pia now sat updating Luna's file. Her hand trembled slightly, not out of fear, but from a creeping sense of helplessness settling into her fingers. The ache of not being able to understand a cry, even when it was so very clear. No fever, no abdominal pain, eating a little, still responsive, but still crying. She wrote, and then left the sentence hanging. From the far corner of the room, where the midday sun slanted in through a tall window, Shire remained, not as close to the basket as before, but near enough for both Pia and Marvin, who had yet to leave, to feel something invisible threading between two beings of different species, different pasts, and no shared memories. Marvin sat on a wooden chair beside the reception desk, chin resting in one hand, eyes lost in the tree line beyond the window. He hadn't said much since placing Luna down, just the occasional question, or quiet attentiveness, as if reverting to the habits of someone long accustomed to the silence of mountain roads. "I've never seen a dog who seemed to understand a kitten's cry," Marvin said softly, glancing at Shire. "He's not asleep. He's just listening." Pia nodded without turning, eyes still fixed on Luna's breathing chart. "Shire used to be a rescue dog, found people after natural disasters. Maybe some of that instinct is still there." "Or maybe it's a feeling he hasn't let go of," Marvin murmured. No one spoke after that. But somehow, they both felt he might be right. That afternoon, a few more volunteers arrived for shift change. Some carried bins of food, others cleaned the kennels. The soft footfalls, the clatter of buckets, the flow of water from a tap. Together they created a background hum, just enough to keep every animal from feeling alone. Luna remained in her basket near the glass wall, where the light was warmer. And even as new sounds filled the room, laughter, voices calling out pet names, Pia could still pick out Luna's tiny cry beneath it all, like a private frequency, only perceptible to those who truly listened. "Maybe she's not calling a person," Pia whispered to herself. "Maybe she's calling a memory." Near the end of the day, Shire suddenly stood, stepped closer, and once again approached Luna's basket. But this time, he didn't wrap himself around it. He simply rested one paw on the rim, gently, barely touching. And for the first time since morning, Luna stayed silent for nearly 10 full minutes. Pia took out her phone and typed a line into the digital journal. "Emotional linkage response may be stabilizing Luna. No clear physiological cause yet. Consider evaluating psychological resonance through extended observation." But then she deleted it, and instead wrote it down by hand in Fern Hollow's traditional notebook, the one reserved only for things that didn't need explaining, only witnessing. "Shire hears what we cannot." Shire had never been one to respond to names. Not Pia's gentle voice, not Marvin's coaxing tone, not even the familiar whistle of his old rescue unit echoing from the technician's radio in the back room could make him turn his head. It wasn't that he couldn't hear. It was as if the name no longer carried the meaning it once did. For Shire, sound no longer triggered action. It simply passed, like wind. Around Fern Hollow, people often reminded each other that Shire was a good dog, just not the kind to get close to. He didn't growl, didn't snap, didn't tear things apart. But he also didn't wag with joy, didn't bounce at greetings, didn't lick hands in affection. Every interaction was measured, just enough to not make anyone feel rejected, but never enough to make them feel special. Unless there was truly something that needed him to listen. The name Shire had been carried over from his days in the Mountain Rescue Unit out of central Montana, where a devastating landslide occurred nearly 4 years prior. In a 5-member, 3-dog team, Shire had been the youngest, only 1 year out of training, but already gifted with an uncanny sensitivity for scent and life beneath rubble. He once saved a child trapped under a collapsed home for 3 days, simply by responding to a breath, so faint it barely stirred the air beneath the crumbling wood and dust. They used to call Shire a miracle. Until the final mission. That year, a woman was reported missing after her hillside cabin was dragged into the river by the slide. The last known coordinates were traced from her phone. Shire and his handler, a young technician named Ellis, were sent to lead the search. They found the site. Shire reacted sharply. He pawed at the soil, barked, growled low and steady. But with the river rushing and the muddy terrain distorting echoes, the command unit dismissed it as a false signal. Orders were issued. Search elsewhere. Shire refused. He circled back to the same spot over and over until Ellis had to tether him and pull him away. No one expected that 3 days later, once the waters receded, the woman's body would be discovered right where Shire had insisted on staying. After that, Ellis left the team. And though Shire remained physically unharmed, something in him fell silent. He stopped responding, stopped searching, stopped cooperating. But he didn't run. It was as if he had accepted that trust had been broken, and with it, the right to speak had faded too. When he was transferred to Fern Hollow, Shire was still a healthy German shepherd by every medical measure. But his file was marked clearly. Not suitable for adoption, lacks bonding behavior, non-responsive to verbal cues. Susan, the center director, had chosen to keep Shire instead of sending him back for retraining. "Because he doesn't need to be fixed," she'd said. "He's just waiting for the right thing to listen to again." Since then, Shire had become a quiet fixture of Fern Hollow. He didn't stay in one place, but always chose locations with the clearest vantage points. Near the entrance in the morning, close to the heaters in late afternoon, by the isolation pen when an animal was ill, and now beside the small yellow basket where Luna had been lying since her arrival. No one had told Shire to go there. But that day, when Pia set the basket down, he had walked over, without being called, without permission, and wrapped himself around the fragile little creature as if he had received a signal no one else could detect. Marvin stood by the tall window, gazing out into the garden beyond. The light lavender hydrangeas had started to tint blue, the pH of the soil shifting after the storm. In the distance, water from the rooftop dripped steadily into a metal trough, creating a soft rhythm like a forgotten lullaby. The stillness was deep enough that even a sigh could echo through it. "Shire's lost someone before, hasn't he?" Marvin asked, not turning around. Pia nodded. Not family, but he knew exactly what too late feels like. And maybe he promised himself he wouldn't stay silent again if given the chance. "So maybe," Marvin said quietly, "it's not that no one calls his name, but that no one ever called it at the right moment." No one replied. But something shifted gently inside Pia, like a ripple just beneath the surface. That evening, as the lights in the center were gradually dimmed, Pia lingered. She took a thin cushion and placed it gently near where Shire lay. Luna, by then, had finally drifted off to sleep, her tiny cries having ceased for several hours. Her breathing was faint, but steady. Pia sat beside them, careful not to disturb the hush that had settled. Shire opened his eyes briefly, looked at her, then closed them again. No reaction. But he didn't turn away. Pia placed her hand gently on his back. "Thank you, Shire," she whispered. "No one asked you to speak again, but thank you for choosing not to stay silent this time." Outside, the rain had begun to fall once more in a soft, steady hush. But in the corner of the room, beneath the golden glow of a warm lamp, a German shepherd lay keeping watch over the sleep of a fragile creature. One without name, without memory, without strength, as if to say, "I'm here, I heard you." The next morning arrived with gentler skies. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the frosted windows of the main building, casting faint yellow streaks across the pine-wood-colored floor, like the trace of a hand that had just wiped away the last of the night's fog from the glass. The chill in the air still lingered, but it no longer felt biting, more like a cool palm laid upon the forehead of someone recovering from a long fever. Luna was moved from short-term isolation into the shared room. She had managed to eat a little, had dozed off here and there, but the quiet cry still persisted. Not a panicked sound, but a soft, rhythmic tone, as if she were still transmitting a signal, waiting for a reply that hadn't come. Pia chose a spot near the window to place Luna's basket, where the morning light could reach the rim just enough to warm her head without overwhelming her. The other animals had grown used to the sound of her cry since the day before. But something shifted the moment she entered this new space. Shire was resting at the far end of the room, beneath a painting of a grassy hill, a piece left behind by a young boy who once stayed at the center during treatment for depression. The dog didn't lift his head as Pia entered. He didn't move when she gently set the basket down and tucked a thin blanket over the kitten's tiny frame. But as soon as her hand left the edge of the basket, Shire rose. No one in the room spoke. A volunteer refilling the water bowl for an old dog named Rufus froze in place. A teenage intern taking notes dropped her pen mid-sentence. Marvin, seated at the front desk, leaned forward instinctively. Shire walked forward slowly, not fast, but with certainty. His steps made no sound, but carried the gravity of someone entering a sacred space. No one dared interfere. No one even thought to stop him. He walked straight to Luna's basket. He didn't sniff, didn't glance at Pia for permission, didn't flinch under the stairs. He simply paused, as if listening to something deeper than sound, then gently lowered himself down beside the basket. The way he lay down, neither curled defensively nor stretched in rest, but instead arched his body in a subtle curve that matched the shape of the basket, then shifted his shoulder forward to wrap around it. Not forcefully, not in haste, but with the care of someone who had waited a very long time to be allowed to do exactly this. Luna stopped crying instantly. Her eyes opened wide in surprise, not from fear, but as if she had just received something. No one could say what it was. A warmth, a heartbeat close by, or perhaps a kind of silent frequency only those who've known abandonment can detect. Pia stepped closer, only to freeze when she heard a faint growl, not a snarl, but a restrained warning hum from deep in Shire's throat. His gaze wasn't hostile, not sharp, but it carried a message. You may watch, but don't separate us. For the first time since arriving at Fern Hollow, Pia saw Shire claim something. But it wasn't possession. It was a quiet declaration. I am the wall. I am the last thing that will stand if the world turns away again. The behavior stunned the entire staff. Shire had never bonded with any other animal. He never reacted when puppies clambered over him, never shared food, never inserted himself into crowded corners. He was the watcher, the one who never stepped into the center. And yet here he was, at the center of something none of them could fully understand. Maybe he's remembering someone, Marvin murmured. Pia nodded, her eyes still fixed on the scene before her. A large dog molding himself into a sheltering arc around a creature 10 times smaller, without a word, without a sigh, just the slow, steady rhythm of Shire's breathing, like waves meeting shore. Luna curled inward, not out of fear, but as if tucking herself into the only remaining space left within the layers of warmth around her. One small paw rested on the edge of the basket, gently touching Shire's chest. The entire center fell into complete silence. That evening, Susan, the center's director, returned from an out-of-town visit. After hearing Pia recount what had happened, she stood in stillness, saying nothing at first, only watching the room through the glass pane. Maybe he doesn't need anyone to call his name anymore, Susan said softly. Because he's found someone who calls to him. Then she opened the center's logbook, the one reserved for special interspecies behaviors, and wrote a single line. Day 4. Shire did not just respond, he chose to protect. Not out of command, but out of connection. A connection we haven't yet understood. 3 days had passed since Shire had wrapped himself around Luna's basket. And in those 3 days, he had hardly moved an inch. No one asked Shire to do it. No training instinct ever demanded that a rescue dog stay beside a kitten, one with no relation, no shared task, no strand of memory in common. But Shire stayed. He didn't go out to the yard, didn't walk to the food bowl, didn't react to the familiar rustle of the feed bins, sounds that even the oldest dogs couldn't resist. Shire didn't need to speak to prove anything. His presence alone said it all. His eyes never left the basket, his breath steady and measured, like the beat of a drum holding time for a delicate melody that Luna was still composing. One faint cry at a time. Pia was the first to notice the change. On Monday morning, she set a tray of food near Shire. No reaction. By afternoon, she placed a bowl of water. Still no movement. On her third attempt, Pia gently placed her hand on Shire's shoulder and gave a soft nudge. His body tensed briefly, then relaxed as if to say, "I know, but not yet." The staff began to whisper. Some were worried, some were moved, some suggested a medical checkup. But all agreed on one thing. No one should interfere. Because, for the first time since arriving at Fern Hollow, Shire was showing a clear purpose, and not once did he need to bark or growl to assert it. "He's not fasting out of grief," Pia told the team during Tuesday's afternoon meeting. "He's refusing to leave his post." Susan nodded. "This isn't abnormal behavior. It's meaningful behavior. And I trust Shire's instinct more than a vet reading right now." Luna still cried, but the cries were growing softer, more spaced apart. At first, Pia took it as a sign of recovery, but on closer observation she realized something wasn't right. Luna's breathing, though rhythmic, would sometimes falter at the end of each exhale. Her eyes often closed but never sank into true sleep. And now and then, her tiny body shivered just slightly, movement so subtle no one would notice unless they were watching closely. And somehow, Shire always had his eyes closed during those moments, as if he were counting each tremble, each short breath, tracking what no one else could detect in time. One morning, Pia sat down beside him. She brought nothing but a blank sheet of paper and a pencil. She didn't write a report. She simply sketched the curve of his body, the line of the basket, the stillness that told more than any photo ever could. With every pencil stroke, she saw more clearly. Shire wasn't just keeping watch. He was someone who had once been responsible for another life, someone who had failed once. And now, he was giving everything left in him to make sure he didn't fail again. The main wall of the center was covered in photos of animals rescued, adopted, or remembered. Beneath one empty frame, Pia taped a small piece of paper, just one line. Some instincts need no reason to be believed. Volunteers walking by often stopped. No one asked questions, but each of them chose to walk softer, speak quieter, and when passing Shire, they would give a slight bow, not out of fear, but out of respect. That afternoon, Marvin returned with a small wooden box. He said nothing. He simply placed it beside Pia. Inside was an old collar, dark brown, worn, with a name carved into it, Shire. "I found it in the storeroom of an old rescue outpost near the border," he said. "I think it was his." Pia looked at the collar, picked it up, the leather softened with age, but the name still clear. She didn't hand it to Shire. She simply placed it beside the basket. What happened next surprised everyone. Shire turned his head and gave the collar a single, slow lick. Not more, Just once. But it was enough for Pia to feel that something had just bridged the space between memory and now. As night fell, Pia returned to the main room once more. She looked into the basket. Luna was asleep, her body curled slightly but no longer trembling. Shire still lay beside her, eyes closed, ears alert, like a soldier standing guard inside someone else's dream. Pia gently draped a soft cloth over his back. "We're here, Shire," she whispered. "But if you believe you're holding something we can't yet see, then keep going. We won't stand in your way." The lights dimmed. The wind outside whispered like autumn exhaling slowly through the leaves, and at the center of it all remained a gaunt German shepherd, quietly following an instinct no one could name. By the fourth morning, a pale fog had settled. The backyard was cloaked in mist, blurring every outline like a painting left unfinished. Inside the shared room, the air remained hushed, as if every motion had been purposefully slowed to a low frequency, just enough to breathe, but not enough to interfere with the signal that pulsed between two creatures lying side by side. Shire hadn't moved. His thin frame still draped partially over the basket, its white woolen trim frayed with time. Luna was tucked within it, her breathing shallow but steady, occasionally shifting as if to make sure the warmth against her hadn't disappeared. The sliding glass door opened with a soft hiss, and Shire's ears twitched. A woman entered, mid-aged, her ash-gray hair tied high, her steps crisp and precise. She carried the scent of antiseptic, gauze, and something fainter still, the quiet musk of old case files. Dr. Myra, the veteran vet the center only called when things could no longer wait. Pia let her in with a whispered summary, but there wasn't much to explain. One glance at Shire and Luna, and the near erasure of space between them, was all Myra needed to understand this wasn't a typical case. She walked forward carefully, each step like someone crossing fragile ice. When she was about a meter from the basket, she stopped, knelt, and extended her hand, not to touch Luna, but to rest gently on the edge of the basket. Shire growled. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a threat. It was a sound rising from deep within his chest, low, dry, contained, like the muffled click of a bolt locking from the inside. Just enough for everyone in the room to stop breathing. Myra didn't retreat, but she didn't advance either. She stayed where she was, her gaze shifting not to Luna, but to Shire's face. "Don't touch her," Pia murmured, more out of reflex than intention. But Myra had already understood, long before the warning reached her. She gave a slight nod, withdrew her hand, and settled on the floor. "I won't touch," she said, her voice graveled with the weight of someone long accustomed to not being trusted at first glance. "I was only asking his permission." Shire didn't growl again, but his ears remained high, not in passive alertness, but in deliberate listening, as if he were tuned into something no language could convey. Dr. Myra didn't rush. She sat still, hands resting on her knees, her gaze softening into the look of someone who once held a life that slipped away, and learned the value of waiting one more minute before acting. "He's not warning me because he resents me," she said quietly, just loud enough for Pia and Marvin to hear. "He's warning me because he knows one wrong move now could sever the rhythm he's working so hard to hold on to." Myra tilted slightly, observing from afar. She saw that Luna's chest didn't rise evenly. The breaths were long, but interrupted midway, as though something lodged deep within her chest was interfering. Not a wheeze, but a kind of catch at the end of each inhale, a sign Myra recognized from cases involving internal organ strain or sealed vascular damage. And somehow Shire had sensed this long before any of them had. A quiet breath escaped Myra's lips. She rose and left the room without a word. But 5 minutes later she returned, this time carrying a square of velvet cloth, a bottle of warm water, and a light wrap. She no longer approached directly. Instead, she placed the velvet beside the basket, the bottle of warm water just within reach, and then slowly sat by the wall, not facing them, not standing guard, simply sitting, like someone listening to pine trees sway in distant wind. Shire glanced her way, but there was no growl this time. His ears lowered slightly, as if silently acknowledging her presence. Not welcoming, not wary, just accepting. And still his entire body remained positioned between the basket and anything else. Pia came to sit beside Myra, lowering herself gently. "Do you think there's something wrong internally?" Myra nodded. "Not just hunger or cold. She may be experiencing vascular trauma or internal fluid buildup. These injuries don't always show outside. But a dog who uses thermal contact to detect changes in heartbeat or breath may pick it up before any monitor." Pia shivered. "What are you planning to do?" Myra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled out a small notebook, scribbled a single line, and handed it to Pia. On the page, one sentence, requesting permission to intervene. But let him lead the way. Pia glanced back at Shire, just as he began shifting his posture, pressing himself closer to the basket. A portion of his body angled over Luna's chest, as if trying to ease some invisible pressure nestled deep inside. Myra offered a quiet smile. "He's showing me the spot." Then she rose slowly, packed up her things, but didn't leave. She simply said, "Tomorrow, if he allows it." No one in the room objected, because they all understood. If there was anyone truly hearing the breath of that fragile little life, it wasn't the doctor and it wasn't the staff. It was a German shepherd, once broken, once silent, and now speaking through the very stillness that once swallowed him. The next morning, the sun rose late. Its light didn't burst through. It crept gently between strands of cloud, as if it too was waiting for permission to touch a moment too fragile to disturb. Fern Hollow was unusually quiet. No cars, no barks from the yard. It was as if the entire center paused to wait. Dr. Myra entered with a small canvas kit. No lab coat, no gloves, just a light gray sweater, sleeves rolled to the wrist, and a stethoscope subtly tucked into her breast pocket. Pia stood ready. In her hand was a brief note. "Luna's sleep remains restless." Breathing still interrupted. Shire was still there, just as he had been, but something in his stance gave Myra pause. He wasn't fully shielding the basket anymore. Shire had shifted to the side, lying on his flank, exposing Luna's chest ever so slightly to the open air, as if he himself had decided to permit the examination. He didn't look at Myra. He didn't growl. He simply rested one paw on the rim of the basket, a silent message. "Go ahead. But I will feel every beat you touch." Myra stepped forward and knelt. She opened her bag, drew out the stethoscope, but didn't place it right away. She let it rest in her hand and waited. 1 minute, 2. Only when Luna's breathing remained unchanged did she gently press the instrument to the kitten's tiny chest. The first sound Myra heard wasn't a heartbeat. It was her own breath catching in her throat. Luna's heart was beating, but irregularly. There were brief pauses, only fractions of a second. But they were enough to create an unsettling rhythm, like a song that plays smoothly until it stumbles on a single uncertain note. Then continues. Then hesitates again. Shire's gaze had shifted now. No longer distant, he was looking directly at Myra, unblinking. not with suspicion but with a question still forming in the air. "Do you hear it now?" Myra removed the stethoscope. She said nothing for several moments, simply pressing her fingers to the bridge of her nose, a habit she had whenever facing an unclear case. "No wheezing, no swelling, but an irregular heartbeat," she finally murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Pia stood nearby, her hands tightening slightly. What could it be? Myra shook her head. Too soon to confirm. It might be fluid buildup. It might be a congenital defect. But one thing is certain. She looked up at Pia, then turned her eyes to Shire. Is that if it weren't for him, no one would have caught this in time. Shire never took his eyes off Luna. He didn't understand medical terms. He didn't know what defect meant. But with a kind of instinct that transcended all language, he understood that something inside this small life beside him wasn't working the way it should. And so, he remained. Her second skin, her parallel rhythm, her warmth, filling in for what her heart could not yet give. Myra took a blank form and scribbled quickly, request echocardiogram. Suspected arrhythmia, monitor next 24 hours, avoid stressors. She placed the form on the desk and exhaled. She's fighting, but it seems her heart is working harder than it should to make up for something missing. Pia looked at Scheuer, his head now resting once again against the side of the basket. Not asleep, not moving, just there. As if he knew that as long as he remained, Luna's heartbeat wouldn't feel alone. That afternoon, a volunteer named Lenny, rarely known for showing emotion, sat down with a black ink pen and sketched the image of Shire and Luna on coarse craft paper. Every curve of the shepherd's frame, every arc of the kitten's small body, came alive not as two separate beings, but as one uninterrupted connection. The drawing was pinned to the large bulletin board in the hallway. Above it, in slanted, uneven handwriting, someone had written, "Some signs only those who choose to stay can ever see." By late afternoon, the skies over Wyoming had turned a brilliant amber orange, the kind of light that only lingers for a few fleeting minutes in autumn, but somehow softens everything too difficult to put into words. In the small medical room of the rescue center, silence held steady. Even breaths were measured, restrained, as if no one wanted to disturb the invisible thread of connection unfolding between Dr. Myra and the tiny life nestled inside the folds of a woolen towel. Shire sat at the edge of the exam table, unmoving, his gaze fixed. Pia stood at the door. Marvin remained by the tray of instruments, and the entire team watched each movement from Myra, the only one now allowed to touch Luna. Leaning down, Myra placed the tip of her index finger gently over the kitten's sternum. Her touch brushed through the soft fur, pausing at a spot that felt warm, pliant, but not right. She pressed very lightly, just enough to sense what lay beneath the delicate skin and bone. A fluid-filled pocket, not large, but pulsing against Luna's fragile, staggered breaths. She didn't speak. She shifted her angle slightly, planted her other hand on the table to steady the pressure, and pressed again. The sensation remained. It wasn't a tumor, nor swelling. It was a fluid sac, growing slowly, quietly, and dangerously. "Bring me the ultrasound," Myra said, her voice suddenly low and firm, stripped of all hesitation. Marvin nodded and darted out. No one asked questions. No one needed further explanation. Myra's expression had already said it all. This was no longer a suspicion. This was urgent. Pia gently slid a fresh towel beneath Luna's body, then lifted the kitten with both hands and transferred her onto the warmed ultrasound pad. Shire lifted his paw instinctively, as if to follow, but stopped. He stayed pressed beneath the table, eyes trained on Myra's every movement. The machine powered on with a sharp beep that broke through the room's hush like a bell, marking the shift from worry to precision. Myra guided the probe carefully beneath Luna's ribcage, smoothed on the gel, and adjusted the angle of her wrist. The monitor flickered to life in blurred monochrome, but with practiced eyes and a heart that had witnessed more life and death than she could count, Myra didn't need long to see what she feared. A pericardial effusion, fluid gathered just outside the heart's protective sac. Not large, but its position was too close. Every beat of Luna's heart looked like it was struggling to clear a rising tide. If they didn't relieve the pressure soon, her heart would suffocate inside its own enclosure. Like a violin string pulled too tight, it would snap without warning. "Cardiac tamponade," Myra said. "Pericardial effusion. We need to relieve it. Now." No one spoke. Pia's hands clenched. Marvin clutched the fabric at his chest. A young staffer near the back raised her hand to her mouth. Only Shire remained still, without alarm, without movement, but with eyes sharp as a scalpel's edge. "You knew," Myra whispered, almost speaking to Shire alone. "From the beginning. You knew." She turned toward the team, her voice cutting clean through the tension. "Prepare for a localized procedure. I don't want her moved. There's no time. Prep the aspiration kit, get the lamp, warm the needle, and—" She paused, then added, slower this time. "Leave Shire in the room." Pia opened her mouth to ask, but only nodded instead. No one objected. Shire wasn't in the way. In fact, his presence seemed to steady the room like a weighted stone in a bowl of water, anchoring everyone's focus. As Myra prepared the needle, Pia sat beside Shire, placing a hand gently on his neck. She said nothing, but her eyes carried a message only he needed to understand. "We're doing everything we can. And you, if you can, keep giving her that warmth until her heart finds its strength again." Shire slowly stretched forward and rested his head beside the table, right where one of Luna's tiny paws dangled loosely from the towel. He didn't touch her, didn't bark, didn't growl. He was simply there, like part of the medical process itself, like an unspoken promise. "I won't leave, no matter what happens." The needle hovered. A hush blanketed the room. No one blinked. And under the pale yellow light, just beneath that fragile chest, life waited to reclaim the space it had been denied for too long. The syringe withdrew. At its tip, a small, cloudy drop of fluid trembled, not large, but heavy with the weight of the silence that filled the room. Dr. Myra steadied the drain with 2 fingers that trembled just slightly, her eyes locked on Luna's chest as her breathing slowly leveled out, like watching a newborn leaf shake free after a long, unforgiving storm. No one spoke. Pia stood by the table, her hand still gripping the edge of her lab coat. Marvin, usually gruff and quick-tongued, had slowly backed into a corner, leaning against the cabinet, eyes fixed on the small creature bundled in the pale brown towel. And just beneath the exam table, Shire remained with his head tilted upward, gaze unblinking. Only when Dr. Myra gently lifted Luna's body and placed her back into the basket did Shire finally rise and step forward. No one intervened. No one dared intrude on the moment. Shire tilted his head, then lowered his muzzle, resting it lightly on the top of Luna's head, right where the softest down was still damp with sweat and antiseptic. He didn't lick, didn't exhale. Just placed it there, like a whisper without sound. Everyone watched, and something quiet eased into the room, into each person standing witness. Pia was the first to speak, her voice barely audible. "He's done that before, hasn't he?" Marvin nodded slowly. When I first saw him with her, it was that same way, muzzle resting on her, like he was breathing for her. Dr. Myra stood, wiping her hands, and glanced around the room. It's not random. That gesture, resting the muzzle on the crown, is a form of grounding behavior. In dogs, it's a way to stabilize the breathing of the weaker one. He's syncing her heartbeat with his presence. A staffer in the back whispered, "It's like he's the part of her heart she's missing." No one corrected the thought. No one felt it was too much. After the procedure, Luna was placed in a heated chamber, connected to monitors tracking her heart rate and temperature. A small device clipped to the side measured her oxygen saturation. Shire was no longer allowed to lie beside her, but even just sitting outside, gazing through the glass, seemed to ease her startles. Her breath steadied whenever he was near. Pia began documenting every change in a small notebook, one column for Luna, and now a separate column just for Shire. She noted each hour he appeared, each tilt of his head, every time he placed his nose near the enclosure, and every instance matched the moments Luna's heartbeat slowed, calmed, and found rhythm. It wasn't coincidence, it was resonance. And soon, it spread through the center. Volunteers who had once viewed Shire with hesitant pity for his withdrawn nature began drawing closer. One brought him an old olive-colored knit scarf. Another kept a clean bowl of fresh water just outside the medical room. Marvin even lowered his voice whenever he entered, not out of respect for the doctor, but for the stillness Shire was preserving. He was no longer the old dog that wouldn't engage. He was part of the rescue team, a member without a lab coat, without a badge, but one who brought instincts and quiet loyalty no instrument could replicate. One late afternoon, as the sunlight turned golden through the window pane, Pia sat down on the floor beside Shire's usual spot. He was there, neither tired nor tense, just silent, as always. "You know," Pia began, her hand resting on his back, "we used to think you didn't belong to anyone. But maybe it's not about belonging to everyone. Maybe you just had to find the one you were meant to stay for." Shire didn't move. He gave a soft sniff. But Pia knew. He heard her, and he understood. Across the glass, Luna turned gently in her sleep, her breath even. The monitor showed a stable rhythm. The jagged, frantic waves from before had smoothed into a gentle line, like the soft, steady footsteps of someone walking beside a very small heart. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the frosted pane of the medical room, stretching in a thread-thin line across the floor until it touched the corner of Luna's basket. The scent of antiseptic still lingered, but the weight of the air had changed. It no longer felt thick. It felt still. Not the stillness of fear, but the quiet of hope waiting to bloom. Outside the door, Shire sat, head resting on the frame. Not asleep, not moving, just present. And that presence alone made the entire medical team adjust their pace whenever they passed, so as not to disrupt the silence he guarded. Myra sat at her desk, eyes locked on the ultrasound printouts from earlier that morning. She circled a small darkened region with her red pencil, a residual fluid pocket, reduced but still there, lingering near the outer wall of Luna's heart. "This won't absorb on its own," she said, her voice rough from a sleepless night. "We need to place a drainage catheter. If we don't, pressure will build again, and next time we might not get a second chance." Marvin nodded, grip tightening around the patient file. "How much time do we have?" Myra exhaled slowly. Not much. A sudden cough, a seizure, any sharp movement, and her heart could compress again. A brief medical meeting was held in the small back room. Just Myra, Pia, Marvin, and the veterinary nurse. On the whiteboard, Myra sketched the drain plan, a pinpoint incision just below the sternum, where the fluid would be released via a microcatheter threaded along the pericardial lining. Pia stared at the diagram for a long moment before asking softly, "Can we do it here?" Myra nodded. For a creature as small as Luna, transporting her would be too risky. I want the environment quiet, with no harsh light. And I want... She paused, turning her head toward the glass-paneled door of the medical room, where Shire was still waiting. Him nearby, within sight. Not on the surgical table, but close enough for Luna to feel him. No one objected. By now, no one doubted Shire's role in this battle. The minor surgery room was set up. Simple, but complete. Focused surgical lamp, sterile drapes, heart monitor connected to a large screen, and the instrument tray laid out precisely to Myra's sequence. Pia gently opened the door and led Shire in first, guiding him to a spot on the floor near the warming chamber, where Luna still lay, breathing faintly. She pointed to the ground and whispered, "Stay here." Just like always. Shire lay down without hesitation, resting his head on his front paws, gaze locked on the chamber's every movement. The procedure began. Myra washed her hands slowly. She wore a thin surgical gown and a soft cloth mask, the kind used for small animals, so her voice wouldn't echo too sharply. Marvin stood beside her with the suction unit. Pia managed the heart monitor. "Drain tube 6, open sterile wrap," Myra instructed, her voice calm and low. The catheter was placed on the tray. The surgical light illuminated Luna's tiny chest, now cleaned and sterilized. The needle touched skin. Steady. 1 beat, 2 beats. The monitor showed a stable rhythm. But as the needle reached the fluid pocket, Luna's body shivered ever so slightly. Pia held her breath. "Normal," Myra whispered. "Neurological reflex, still within safe range." The needle went 1 millimeter deeper. A drop of fluid emerged, small as dew, yet heavy with the release of pressure that had imprisoned a fragile heart. The catheter began to draw. Her heart rate gradually stabilized. The monitor chimed back into a steady range. No one spoke, but everyone in the room knew. This was a threshold. A door cracked open. Shire shifted forward slightly. Everyone saw it, but no one stopped him. He wasn't interfering. He simply moved a few inches closer, letting his breath reach the rhythm that had just been freed. Myra removed her mask and sat back after the procedure. She nodded, exhaled, eyes slightly red. "Catheter is in place. Drainage is even. We did it." Outside, the light slanting through the window turned amber, spilling across the spot where Luna now lay. The entire room softened. The curtain stirred gently in the breeze. A kind of peace rarely found in emergency rooms settled quietly into the space. Pia placed her hand on Shire's shoulder. "Today," she said quietly, "maybe you said something no one else heard." A whisper from a different sun. Shire didn't respond. But the way he lowered his eyes, almost like a nod to the waning light, told everyone in the room that what had just happened wasn't only medicine. It was something deeper, a connection that bypassed science, a dog keeping a promise for the weakest heart in the center. As the catheter neared the end of its drainage, Luna's heart monitor continued to display steady signals. The waveform was soft and consistent, the numbers gently oscillating within the safe zone, like a whispered reassurance from life, returning to where it belonged. Myra carefully secured the catheter with 2 thin adhesive tabs, her eyes never leaving Luna's chest as it rose and fell. Pia wiped sweat from her brow, trying to keep her hands steady even though everything was, at last, going as planned. Marvin checked the drained fluid one final time, counting under his breath. 32 milliliters. We're good. Then suddenly the monitor fell silent. No one moved fast enough. The bouncing waveform collapsed into a single, flat line, long, still, and unfeeling. The heart rate display showed a cold dash. The room froze. Pia stood stunned. Marvin dropped the clamp he'd been holding. The sharp clatter of metal hitting tile rang out, slicing through the thick silence. Myra lunged forward, both hands on Luna's body, lips pressed into a tight line. "No! No, not now!" In that moment, an impossibly long minute, every sound vanished. The wind beyond the door, the curtains rustle, the footsteps in the hall, all fell away. Only silence remained, stretched thin like a pause between heartbeats. And then, a different sound. Not from machines, not from anyone in the room. A faint snuffle. Shire. No one had noticed when he stood. No one gave him permission, but drawn by something no command could control, he approached the treatment table, where Luna lay, small and unmoving. No rush, no panic. Just Shire, placing one front paw softly on the edge of the towel. Then, slowly, he leaned in. His muzzle touched the kitten's chest, right over the place where her heart should have been beating. No one said a word. No doctor could explain what had just happened. But no one dared interrupt it either. Because in that moment, every medical theory, every emergency protocol, every modern tool was powerless. There was only Shire, and the quiet warmth from his body transferred through a single point of contact. 1 second. 2, 5. Then, a small beep from the monitor. Pia turned immediately. A number appeared. 42 beats per minute. Weak, slow, but real. A wavering line flickered upward, crooked, trembling but alive. Another beat. And another. Myra nearly broke into tears on the spot. She whispered, "Her heart's back. She's coming back." No one dared breathe deeply just yet. But every person in the room felt it, as though a sliver of light had just slipped through a door no one had opened. Shire didn't move. He kept his muzzle pressed against Luna's chest. But now there was a change. Each breath raised his chin slightly, lifted by the motion of her ribcage. Life was returning, in the smallest, most fragile motions. Marvin bent to retrieve the dropped clamp, but his eyes never left the scene. What did he just do? Pia answered without turning. He didn't have to do anything. He just had to be there. Myra steadied herself, quickly checking the readings. Ventricular activity is back. No pneumothorax from the drainage. She's not out of danger yet, but... She looked at Shire. He just held onto a heartbeat we nearly lost. That night, the entire center fell into a state that had no name. The hallway stayed quiet. The overhead lights dimmed to a soft glow. In the medical room, Pia placed a thin cushion beside Luna's chamber, reserved for Shire. For the first time, Marvin didn't lock the back entrance after his shift. He sat at the computer, replaying the extracted surveillance footage from the procedure window. When the recording reached the moment the monitor flatlined, only to spike again just as Shire placed his muzzle on Luna's chest, he stopped. Then rewound. Then played it again. There was no medical rationale. No textbook chapter ever mentioned it. But he knew, as did everyone at Fern Hollow, that what had happened wasn't a miracle. It was a whisper, from a world only dogs could hear. The emergency room no longer pulsed with the frantic rhythm of boots on tile, shouted commands, or heartbeats racing against time. In the stillness that followed the crisis, everything slipped into a fragile quiet, where even breathing felt sacred. On the monitor linked to Luna's tiny frame, the soft green waveform still rose and fell, weak but steady. The number 47 beats per minute glowed, low, not yet safe, but no longer a flat line. Shire remained where he was, his head resting on his forepaws, eyes trained on the warming chamber. He didn't move, didn't step closer, because he knew. His part was done. Myra stood at the far side of the table, her gloves still on, but her arms hung loosely by her sides, as if every ounce of energy had drained with her tears. She wasn't one to cry. In 20 years of veterinary medicine, from snowstorm rescues in Montana to critical care units in Nebraska, she had learned how to keep calm amid chaos. But this morning, she cried. Silently, eyes wide, tears flowing freely. Pia handed her a tissue, but didn't say anything. "We won't get another moment like that," Myra murmured, her voice fractured but steady. "And we'll never forget it." She stepped closer to the bed, looking down at Luna, the kitten who had brushed against the line between life and everything beyond it. Shire let out a faint whine, barely a sound. It wasn't warning, it wasn't pain. It was something softer, like an exhale of relief, like something inside him had just unknotted. Marvin sank to the floor, back against the supply cabinet. He looked at Shire, not like a dog, but like a soldier who had completed a mission no one else could comprehend. He knew, Marvin said under his breath. From the beginning, he knew this moment would come. Pia leaned in, gently stroking Shire's back. She didn't speak, but a soft smile appeared at the corner of her mouth, the smile of someone finally breathing again after a journey through held breaths. Luna had not fully awakened, but her eyelids began to flutter. A tiny movement, like a butterfly flitting through a dream. Myra checked the vitals once more, adjusted the IV drip, then gently placed a lightweight fleece blanket across half of Luna's body. Not just for warmth, but as one final gesture of protection for a life that had fought harder than anyone expected. The kitten's heartbeat is gradually stabilizing. Drainage remains steady. Spontaneous breathing has returned, Myra said, this time with the steady voice of a seasoned chief vet back in control, though the shimmer in her eyes betrayed the emotional residue still clinging to her. That night, the center dimmed its lights earlier than usual. The treatment wing was kept in complete silence. Pia moved Luna's incubator into a smaller, quieter room adjacent to the staff quarters, where only soft amber light spilled across the floor, and the gentle scent of lavender oil lingered like a hush. She fluffed a cushion for Shire, adjusting it into place. But Shire didn't lie down. He remained sitting, silent, unmoving, like a statue carved out of dusk, eyes fixed on every faint sound that rose from Luna's enclosure. When Marvin passed by, he left a small dog biscuit on a plate near the door, murmuring almost to himself, "No one teaches this, and no one can fake it." Around 1 a.m., Pia returned for a final check before resting. She found Luna lying on her side, her head nestled gently against the corner of the cloth, eyes still closed, but her mouth slightly open, letting out a soft, weak mew, like a call whispered through a dream. Shire stood up immediately. No cue was given, no command needed. He walked over, lay down against the outside wall of the incubator, his body pressed gently against the plastic, his tail curled in tight. He didn't bark, he didn't whimper, he simply lay there, so the sound of Luna's dreams would have someone to hear them. Pia watched that quiet scene unfold and exhaled a breath so soft it felt like a blessing in disguise, then turned and stepped away into the hallway. And when the sun finally rose the next morning, its rays streamed through the thick glass pane and landed squarely in the corner where Shire lay. A pale golden circle of light settled onto his dark fur, then stretched forward, reaching the edge of Luna's cloth-covered form, like the touch of something divine. No one called out. No alarm sounded. and yet somehow both opened their eyes in the same moment. Together. And when that light reached Shire's deep brown gaze, Pia, who had just stepped into the room, froze at the threshold. She didn't speak. She simply smiled. The heartbeat had returned, and with it, something deeper than life itself. Trust. Luna lay wrapped in a hand-woven white cotton blanket, one of Pia's special stash, too gentle for the hospital's thick utility bedding, saved for creatures too fragile for the world. The procedures were done, but what lingered in the air was not relief, not joy, but something quieter. Gratitude. The kitten was still weak, her breaths still shallow, but they were there, each inhale and exhale gaining shape. Every time her tiny lungs expanded, the edge of the blanket rose slightly, as if even the cloth had taken up the task of holding her gently in place. Shire remained where he was, his head lifted, eyes tracking every small movement. No one asked him to. There was no clinical protocol for this, but from the very first moment until now he had never turned away. Not once. Pia sat on the wooden chair by the table, her shoulders slumped, but her eyes still carrying light. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The feeling in the room didn't require language, nor applause, nor even recognition. It was a kind of embrace, not made by arms, but by presence. Myra emerged from the equipment room with a sheet of Luna's vital stats. She nodded slowly. So subtly it was barely a gesture, as though she were only confirming to herself. She's going to make it. Marvin quietly filled Shire's water bowl and placed it gently a few inches from his paws. Shire didn't move to drink, but his eyes softened, as if the act alone had said, "Thank you for letting me be here." In that fragile silence, Myra sat down beside Pia. Both women gazed toward the small incubator, where a life once thought gone now rested, wrapped in warmth, under a soft glow, and under the breath of a silent companion. "For the first time in all these years," Pia said gently, "I saw an animal bring faith back to a doctor, not the other way around." Myra didn't respond right away, but her voice was fuller when it came. "And that's exactly why we never stopped believing." Shire exhaled softly, a stream of breath from his nose that left a small fog on the incubator glass, like a final dot in a melody still being written. The last rays of the day slipped through the rear window and fell across Shire's coat, forming a faint halo on his back. The deep brown, the ash gray, the fading gold of afternoon, all blended together like brushstrokes on a silent painting meant only for the heart. Luna stirred, curling deeper into her blanket. One tiny paw slipped out, touching the edge of the enclosure. And gently, instinctively, Shire lowered his head and placed his muzzle exactly where that little paw had reached. No more, no closer, just a single touch, as if to say, "You're not alone." Pia slowly rose, stretched her arms, then turned to Shire and said, "We'll leave you two in peace. You're on watch tonight, okay?" Shire didn't answer. Of course not. But his gaze never left Luna. The team quietly withdrew from the room. The lights were dimmed, the ventilation adjusted to maintain a stable temperature. Inside that small space, where a fragile life had just crossed back from the edge, only the soft rhythm of the respirator remained, the whisper of air brushing against the curtains, and two wordless breaths, one large, one tiny, blending into one. Out in the hallway, Marvin gently shut the glass door behind him, then turned to Myra. "How many times in your life have you witnessed a moment like that?" Myra paused, then shook her head slowly. "You can't count moments like that with numbers. All I know is, each one is different, but every time, it's real." Marvin nodded, then whispered like a promise to himself, "Tomorrow, we're writing this story down. So even those who weren't here can still believe there are embraces that need no words. Night had barely fallen when a call from a veterinary hospital on the outskirts of Ridgeway came through. Myra spoke evenly, but everyone could see the shift in her eyes. It was no longer the gaze of a clinician simply fulfilling her duty, but of someone who had become deeply, personally involved. "The initial drainage results are promising," she said, eyes fixed on the pulsing monitor. "But given her condition, Luna needs to be transferred to an ICU unit with continuous cardiorespiratory monitoring." Pia froze. "Now? You mean tonight?" "Tonight," Myra confirmed. "Every hour right now is a test." Susan, the center's manager, stepped into the small conference room. Her face was calm, though her hair was still tousled from a long shift. When she saw Shire, still seated, unwavering in his watch over Luna's every breath, she didn't ask anything. She just stood there for a long moment. "Do we have enough people?" she asked briskly. "Pia will go in the rescue vehicle," Myra responded. "I'll follow in a separate car in case we need to resupply. Marvin will drive, but—" Myra paused. "What about Shire?" Pia asked, voicing the unspoken thought. Susan looked toward the window, where the streetlight cast a faint shadow on the glass. She didn't hesitate for long. "Shire goes too," she said firmly. "Not for sentiment, but because if Luna has any extra chance at survival, he is part of that chance." The white transit van was readied quickly. Medical kits, mobile monitoring equipment, thermal blankets, and the specialized transport crate were secured in place. Luna was gently laid in the isolation pod, wrapped in 3 layers of cloth beneath a soft red warming light. Her breaths were steady but faint, her eyes still closed. A soft harness was fitted around Shire's neck, but no leash was needed. He stepped into the van on his own, without command, without sound. Just one glance toward Luna told him everything he needed to know. Pia sat beside the crate, constantly checking vitals. Marvin climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The back doors shut, and the amber glow of the center faded behind them. The journey began. Outside, the Fern Hollow forest had fallen into its deepest layer of night. The tall pine trees lining both sides of the road seemed even taller in the dark, their trunks like silent pillars guarding the mountain trail. The headlights swept through each bend, slicing into the low fog rising from the earth. Inside the van, the hum of the engine merged with the soft beeping of the heart monitor. No one spoke. All emotions had shifted into glances. Pia watched the screen, Marvin watched the road, and Shire only watched one thing: where Luna lay. The red light bathed his face, casting a warm edge along his muzzle and folded ears. Whenever Luna stirred slightly, Shire tilted his head, just enough to check that all was still all right. As they crossed the old steel bridge leading out of the woods, Marvin cracked the driver's side window. Night air poured in, laced with pine, cool soil, and a trace of wildflowers drifting up from the valley slope. "Sometimes," he murmured, "you'll never understand how a dog can know before the doctors do. But if the universe is fair at all, tonight, it's because of him." No one responded, but Pia reached over and gently placed her hand on Shire's back. For the first time during the entire ride, Shire turned his head. Not to check anything, just to say, "I know, and I'm doing this right." As the clock neared midnight, they reached the junction where the sign for Ridgeway Animal ICU glowed like a soft beacon in the dark forest. Marvin slowed, clicked on the turn signal, and the van eased onto the gravel path, flanked by dew-covered hills. No one said a word, but they all shared the same thought. The fight wasn't over, but at least they were still in it. Together. Shire rose as the van came to a stop. Pia opened the rear door, and as the emergency wing's lights spilled in, Shire stepped out first, slowly, calmly, like a soldier paving the way for something sacred that was about to unfold. The glass doors of the intensive care unit at Ridgeway Animal ICU closed with the faintest of sounds, so quiet almost no one noticed. But for Shire, that sound marked something absolute. The moment Luna was taken inside, and he was not allowed to follow. The room beyond was fully isolated, a transparent pane now blurred slightly by the mist forming from the temperature difference between the outside air and the specialized climate control inside. Within, Luna was placed gently on a thermal pad, connected to a heart monitor, a respirator, and an IV line that traced a delicate arc into the soft fur behind her ear. Outside, Shire sat. Unmoving. No barking. No whining. Just sitting there, his eyes locked on the tiny form inside, his nose gently resting against the exact spot on the glass where she lay opposite him. A young doctor passed by, bending slightly as if to offer comfort to the dog, but when he saw that gaze, one not filled with confusion, nor pleading, nor fear, but something firm and immovable, he paused, and then quietly stepped away, as though he had unknowingly entered a sacred stillness that did not belong to people. Inside the room, Pia remained, coordinating the transfer notes and medical protocols. She happened to glance toward the glass wall. The bright overhead light reflected off the surface, leaving only a dim outline of Shire's face, but the silhouette was enough. Large, motionless, loyal, alone, but never truly alone. Nearly 2 hours later, when all systems had been stabilized and protocols confirmed, Pia stepped out. She walked over to Shire, crouched down beside him, and placed a hand on the floor next to his paws. "She's fighting hard," she said softly. "The numbers are still low, but better than earlier. They'll let you in. Just not yet." Shire didn't turn his head. His focus remained on the fragile rhythm behind the glass, as if every tiny motion in Luna's body was tethered to him by an invisible thread no one else could see. Marvin returned shortly before 3 a.m. The moment his truck pulled into the lot, he noticed the still shape pressed against the glass corridor. "He's still sitting there?" he asked Pia when they met near the automatic coffee machine. Pia nodded. "Hasn't moved. No food. No rest." Marvin poured 2 cups and handed her one. "Maybe he doesn't need anyone to tell him where to be. Maybe he already knows better than any of us." The night air in Ridgeway wasn't as biting as Fern Hollow's, but it still held a chill that called for a jacket. Marvin gently draped his over Shire's back, but minutes later, it slipped to the ground. Shire hadn't moved at all. Ears still alert, eyes still locked through the glass. Luna still hadn't opened her eyes, but her heartbeat was stronger now. Her limbs twitched gently, like her tiny frame was testing whether it remained in this world, or had already begun to drift toward another light. Near 5 a.m., Myra stepped out. She rubbed her arms as if coming back into her own body. "I've never seen a kitten respond this quickly after trauma," she said, breath fogging slightly in the hallway air. "Could it be Shire?" Marvin asked quietly. Myra didn't answer directly. Instead, she turned and looked at him, at the dog who hadn't moved for hours, and replied, "We forget that some medicines don't exist in any handbook. They live in breath, in gaze, in the space between 2 beating hearts, no matter if they belong to the same species or not." Dawn was beginning to break. The first threads of sunlight slipped through the eastern medical wing, casting a narrow ribbon of warmth down the corridor floor. And at that very moment, Luna whimpered softly in her sleep. Not loud, not clear, but just enough to make the monitor register a fresh tone. Shire lifted his head slightly, ears tilting towards the sound. He didn't bark. He simply inhaled deeply, then gently pressed his nose back to the same spot on the glass, where the night's condensation had not yet fully disappeared. Behind that pain, a small life was still fighting, and outside it, a silent soul stood guard, not by command, not by training, not by logic, but by something else entirely, something unspoken that everyone could still feel. The Ridgeway morning had a kind of still beauty that felt almost sacred. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the sky had already drained the last of the night's darkness, replacing it with a pale blue that washed over the rooftops like a silent blessing. The air itself was calm, like one long, expectant breath held between hope and reverence. In the east hallway, the one lined with tall glass looking directly into the ICU, Shire remained seated, not shifting, not slumping, not turning away. Only his eyes moved, and even then only slightly, as if every flicker from the tiny body inside echoed through the deep brown of his gaze. Susan arrived without needing to announce herself. She walked softly, carrying a light blanket and a thermos of warm tea. Her face bore the quiet fatigue of a night spent on her feet, but her eyes carried something else, something rare, like the quiet reverence one feels when standing before a moment too beautiful to touch. She sat down next to Shire, slowly, without saying a word. Shire glanced at her briefly but didn't shift an inch. Not a greeting, just an acknowledgement. "You're here, I know. You haven't slept at all, have you?" Susan spoke softly, her eyes fixed on the ICU room where Luna lay, her tiny frame almost vanishing beneath the web of tubes and glowing monitors. "She's still fighting, and I think part of it is because you're here." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "I never used to believe in that kind of thing. Not until today." Shire didn't respond, but his nose gently pressed once more against the same spot on the glass from the night before. This time, his breath left a clearly defined misty ring, like a quiet imprint of presence, of loyalty without language. Marvin and Pia arrived not long after, bringing fresh coffee. When Pia saw Susan sitting beside Shire, she let out a breath that was half whisper, half realization. "You couldn't leave either, could you?" Susan didn't deny it. She just smiled and glanced towards the dog. "All night, everyone's been asking doctors, reading charts, checking numbers, but only he knew exactly where to be, and he didn't need anyone to explain why." At that moment, a young nurse walked down the hallway, carrying a clipboard with Luna's updated stats. When she noticed Shire, she paused, then turned to Pia and asked softly, "What's his name?" Pia hesitated, her lips parted to say Shire, like she had so many times before. But before the word came out, Susan answered first, quiet but clear. "The Silent Guardian." No one questioned it. No one laughed. No one asked for an explanation. Because in just a few hours, that name had become more real than any record ever could. A soul that asked for no title, no applause, no command. Only to be exactly where he was, at exactly the right time. Inside the ICU, Luna stirred slightly. Her eyes remained closed, but her chest rose more rhythmically now. Each breath was still faint, but steady, like someone outside was somehow syncing their own heartbeat to hers, holding her in rhythm. Pia stepped away to refill water. Marvin closed his eyes and dozed briefly on the bench across the corridor. Susan stayed, still seated beside Shire, still silent. Those moments, quiet, weightless, stretched long, like time had folded into itself. No one wanted to break it. Because in that hush, life, instinct, and connection converged, not through words, not through medicine, just through being, two living beings, one on the inside, fighting through every shallow breath, one on the outside, still and constant, keeping vigil, like they were sharing the same fragile heartbeat. By late morning, sunlight filtered through the old maple branches outside, casting soft yellow streaks across the polished tiles of the ICU hallway, like gentle fingers pulling back the last shadows of night. The air inside the hospital no longer held that sharp edge from earlier hours. Footsteps slowed, whispers quieted, and the eyes of the staff began to hold something else entirely, something beginning to resemble hope. In the small room where Luna lay under special care, the numbers on the monitor finally began to stabilize. Her heartbeat was still slow but consistent, her breathing shallow but no longer fragmented. Each slight increase in rhythm drew glances between the medical staff, and each time their eyes shifted again to the window, to the figure that had never moved. Dr. Myra stepped out at exactly 10:20 a.m. The back of her lab coat showed a faint trace of sweat, but her eyes had changed, lit with something soft and rare. It wasn't the shine of triumph, but the quiet rekindling of belief, after hours that had felt like walking through dusk without direction. She approached the group, Susan, Pia, Marvin, and Shire, still sitting exactly where he had all along, nose to glass, body steady as stone. "She's past the critical stage," Myra said, her voice low and slightly trembling. "There are still risks, post-op infection, possible respiratory setbacks, but if you ask me now, I'd say her chances are much better than before." Marvin exhaled, one hand pressing to his chest, as though a weight he'd carried since midnight had finally slipped away. Pia covered her face with both hands, and her tears came, not the kind that broke, but the kind that restored. Susan didn't say anything. She turned to Shire instead. And in that moment, she saw something she hadn't seen once since the beginning of it all. Shire's tail moved. Not quickly, not eagerly. Just a small, deliberate sweep, like a signal passed in silence. "I understand." The group froze. Pia let out a soft gasp. Marvin smiled but didn't speak. And Susan, she simply watched, long and quietly, at that part of the German shepherd that had remained motionless for nearly 2 days. "She knows," Susan whispered. "She's always known." Shire slowly turned his head toward Myra. The doctor bent down, placed her hand gently on his head, then stroked his back in one steady line. "Thank you," Myra murmured, "not just for staying, but for believing in something we, who call ourselves professionals, couldn't bring ourselves to trust in time." Inside the ICU, Luna stirred again. This time it wasn't an unconscious twitch, but a small, deliberate motion, as if she were trying to turn her head toward the sliver of light filtering in from the narrow window above. Pia quickly adjusted the oxygen tube. Marvin pressed his hand softly against the glass. And Shire remained there. But now his tail began to wag, not in bursts, not excitedly, but in a slow, steady rhythm. One beat, then another, like a quiet drumline to a brand new symphony, where all old sounds had passed, and only the first breaths of a rescued life remained. "Silent guardian," Pia said gently, half as a greeting, half as a quiet acknowledgement. No one in that ward kept their composure after that. An elderly nurse quietly wiped her glasses. A young doctor left his chart just to stand still and take in the moment for a few long seconds. Because sometimes a life isn't saved by medicine alone. Sometimes it's the result of things no chart can measure: a gaze, a presence, and a tail that wags without a single sound. A week passed. The Ridgeway Veterinary Hospital moved with its usual rhythm, but something had shifted. In the East Wing, down the hall toward room 3A, the air felt gentler, like time itself had chosen to slow down. Luna, the kitten who once breathed with the fragile thread of life, had begun to stretch again in her padded bed. just small movements, turning her head when footsteps neared, extending one paw beyond the blanket, or lifting her chin slightly at the familiar sound from behind the glass. And somehow, at some unmarked point in time, it became instinct. Every time Luna made a sound, whether a faint mew for food or a restless breath in sleep, Shire would rise, immediately, without instruction. He didn't bark, he didn't panic. He simply stepped closer, placed his muzzle near the bed's edge, or sat tall with his chin resting on the window frame, watching every twitch like a steady sentinel. And most of the time, when he did that, Luna stopped crying. No training, no commands, only a silent understanding. Susan once stood behind the door, watching them without a word. She couldn't explain why her chest tightened, not from pity, not quite from awe, but from something stranger, as though she was witnessing two puzzle pieces that had wandered for too long, finally finding their way back to the same picture. "They've both lost something," she told Pia one late afternoon, the sunlight casting long streaks across the hallway windows. "What do you mean?" Pia asked, holding a cup of steaming tea. "Not just physical wounds," Susan said slowly. "Something deeper, like invisible scars. Shire, he's never really connected with anyone since arriving at the center, and Luna, when she first got here, her eyes looked so empty, like both of them had lost the one thing that made life feel real." Pia nodded, but said nothing. Her eyes remained fixed on the glass window, on the German shepherd standing guard, and the kitten sleeping peacefully. Marvin arrived on the 8th day, carrying a soft, chicken-flavored cat food pouch he called the good stuff for fresh fighters. But when he walked into the room, he didn't need to ask who Luna was, because seeing Shire lying down, posture alert yet softened whenever Luna stirred, made it unmistakably clear. "Wow," Marvin whispered, "the way he watches her. Like he's afraid if he blinks, he'll lose her all over again." Luna had begun eating, just a little, but clearly willing. Dr. Myra was elated when, on the 9th morning, Luna licked her own paw for the first time. A tiny act of self-care, yet a giant step forward. And oddly enough, every time Luna made progress, Shire's tail would move. No one told him to. No one said it was a milestone. But perhaps for Shire, every second Luna kept breathing was a victory worth marking. Then, one morning, as the sun rose softly, Luna opened her eyes, wide, and stared for the first time, long and still, toward the glass. Pia, mid-note in her clipboard, froze. "She's looking at someone," she whispered. Susan stepped forward, and just as she did, Shire walked up, stopping exactly where he always did. Luna lifted her head. Her neck still trembled, but her gaze didn't waver. She was looking straight at Shire. Pia held her breath. Then something no one expected happened. Luna, slowly, shakily, began to crawl toward the edge of the bed, toward the window. "She knows," Susan whispered. "She always has." Shire slowly turned his head and looked toward Myra. The doctor knelt down and gently pressed her hand to his head, her palm gliding down the curve of his spine. "Thank you," Myra said softly. "Not for staying, but for believing in something the rest of us, experts, hadn't dared to believe in yet." Inside the ICU, Luna stirred. This time it wasn't an unconscious twitch, but a small, deliberate movement, like she was trying to turn her head toward the light trickling through the high window pane. Pia quickly adjusted the breathing tube. Marvin pressed his hand to the glass, and Shire remained still. But now his tail was wagging more steadily, once, then again, like the soft beat of a drum marking the rhythm of something new, a quiet overture to a life saved from slipping away. the silent guardian. Pia murmured the name, not as a label, but as gratitude and as truth. No one in the ward that day kept their usual emotional distance. An older nurse wiped her glasses. A young doctor stepped out of the diagnostics room just to stand there in silence for a few minutes. Because sometimes, the miracle of survival isn't just the triumph of medicine. It's the result of things unseen. A gaze held too long, the patience of staying, and the wag of a tail when no one else dared to hope. A week passed. At Ridgeway Veterinary Hospital, the air seemed to shift with each breath of a small creature. Other patients were still being treated, cases still urgent, but in the hallway near room 3A on the east wing, there was always a gentler hush, like time itself had slowed down there. Luna, the kitten who once breathed in strands of thread-thin hope, could now lift herself ever so slightly in her blanket-lined bed. The movements were small, turning her head toward the sound of footsteps, stretching her paw beyond the warm cloth, or arching her neck when she heard a familiar sound beyond the glass. At some point, no one knew exactly when, it simply became natural. Whenever Luna meowed, whether from hunger or in a restless dream, Shire would be there immediately, as if hardwired into her rhythm. He didn't bark, he didn't panic. He just walked over, placed his muzzle by the edge of her bed, or sat upright and rested his chin on the frame of the glass, watching every small motion with focused calm. And most of the time, Luna would stop crying. No one had trained him, no cue was given, but somehow they found each other, in silence. Susan once stood behind the door, just watching them. She didn't understand why her chest tightened so suddenly, not from sadness, not quite from sentiment, but from something deeper, like witnessing two pieces of a puzzle that had wandered too long, finally returned to their place in the same picture. "They've lost something," she said to Pia one late afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the windows and flooded the corridor. "What do you mean?" Pia asked, cupping a steaming mug of tea. "Not just injuries to their bodies," Susan answered slowly, "but something deeper. Invisible wounds. Shire, since the day he arrived, never truly connected to anyone. And Luna, when she first got here, her eyes were just empty, like both of them had lost the one thing that made life make sense." Pia nodded, saying nothing. Her eyes stayed on the same glass panel, where a dog kept watch and a kitten slept peacefully. Marvin returned on the 8th day. He brought a small tub of soft, chicken-flavored food, what he called a special treat for the recovering ones. But when he entered the room, he didn't need to ask which one was Luna, because just by looking at Shire lying with his body still and his eyes calm, yet always alert when Luna stirred, anyone could tell. There was no mistaking them now. "Wow," Marvin whispered. "The way he looks at her, like he's afraid that blinking might mean losing her forever." Luna had begun to eat. Not much, but with interest and intention. Dr. Myra was most delighted when, on the morning of day 9, Luna tried to lick her own toes. That single gesture, tiny as it seemed, carried the weight of monumental progress. And something strange happened. Every time Luna made a little progress, Shire's tail would tap, gently. No one taught him that. No one said this was something worth celebrating. But to Shire, every second Luna kept living felt like a victory. Then, one morning, as the sun rose, Luna opened her eyes, wide, and held her gaze on the glass. Pia, who was taking notes, froze. "She's looking at someone," she whispered. Susan came closer. And just then, Shire stepped forward, stopping in the familiar spot. Luna raised her head, her neck still trembling slightly, but her eyes, those stayed locked in place. She was looking straight at Shire. Pia held her breath, Then something happened. Something no one had expected. Luna began dragging herself slowly towards the edge of the bed, toward the glass. Her forehead touched the very spot where Shire was on the other side. And just as it did, Shire lifted one paw and pressed it gently to the glass. Right there. No words, no sound. Just two tiny beings, one who had failed and one who had nearly vanished, now touching through a barrier that no longer separated anything at all. By that evening, the entire hospital staff had come to know. If Luna whimpered, stirred, or breathed too fast, even for a moment, there would always be a guardian at the glass, never stepping away. They weren't doctors. They weren't trainers. They didn't heal each other with knowledge or words. They simply stayed, as if they shared the same scar. But this time the scar was no longer alone. The morning at Ridgeway wasn't unusual. Clear skies, soft sunlight, oak trees outside the hospital swaying gently like they were relearning how to breathe. But for those standing by the window of room 3A, this was a day unlike any other. Because for the first time, Luna didn't cry. No drawn-out meows, no fidgeting under the blankets, no need for Shire's comforting presence to calm her down. Instead, they saw a kitten, still small, still fragile, but with dry, bright eyes, playing. Pia noticed first. She was updating the IV schedule when she turned and froze. Right there in the fabric-lined bed, Luna was tapping a small plastic ball, a toy Marvin had quietly left behind days earlier. A hesitant tap. Then another. The ball rolled gently, bumping into the side of the bed. And then, Luna chased after it. No prompting, no sound, just a tiny creature responding to her very first instinct, curiosity, not survival. Shire, resting near the front hallway, stirred the moment the ball tapped the fabric wall. He didn't rush in. Didn't paw at the door like before. He simply walked to the floor-level window, lay down, and placed his head along the edge, just enough to see the entire corner where Luna played. And then he closed his eyes. Pia quietly called Susan. "Come look." Susan walked in, carrying a folded blanket. But what stopped her mid-step in the hallway was the image. A German shepherd lying by the windowsill, still as stone, but with eyes that seemed to smile, and a tiny kitten batting at a ball, chasing it, and then stretching forward again. For the first time in days, Luna played on her own. No saving needed, no hyper-vigilance, and most importantly, no need to hide her heart anymore. Marvin arrived just in time to see her leap, only a few inches, but enough to make him turn away and take a deep breath. "She's not afraid anymore," he said softly. That lunch, Pia wrote one simple entry into the medical log. Day 12, post-emergency. Subject demonstrates active, independent interaction with objects. Psychological state, stable. Emotional state, self-recovering. Below that, Susan added a handwritten note in purple ink. And a dog is sleeping, peacefully, beneath the very light where she first stretched toward the world. Dr. Myra came by in the late afternoon. She didn't step into the room, only stood outside, quietly observing. Just as Pia turned to speak, Myra raised her hand, then reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an old ultrasound print, Luna's scan from the emergency night, showing the fluid around her heart. "I was going to throw it away," Myra said, "but then I thought, some things deserve to be kept, to remind us that some heartbeats nearly stop yet go on, because someone dared to believe before we even noticed." Around 4 p.m., sunlight cut across the room. Luna, after pushing the ball aside, lay down. She didn't turn toward the bed's edge this time. She turned toward the window, where Shire still rested. She rested her head on her forelegs. Her tail curled. Her eyes blinked, then slowly closed. Outside, Shire lay still, as though his task today had ended. No alarms, no irregular heartbeats, no tears. Just two creatures, once lost to the world, now quietly side by side, sharing a single frame of stillness. No words, no contact. But anyone looking could see. Their world had changed. Forever. The story of Shire and Luna isn't just a survival tale between two fragile souls. It is a quiet reminder that life often seeks life, through pathways that reason and science can't always explain. A once silent German shepherd and a kitten who only knew how to cry didn't find each other through speech, but through something far older: the instinct to protect and the need to be held. Amid all the machines, the sterile protocols, and the rush of modern care, it was Shire's quiet, unwavering presence that became Luna's first real medicine. Shire doesn't need to be called a hero. He doesn't wait for applause. But in every quiet breath beside her, in every soft whine, in every wag of his tail, he reminds us that dogs are more than companions. They are keepers of the things we forget too easily: patience, loyalty, and love without condition. So if anyone still doubts the power of kindness, just look at a dog and a cat, once nearly lost to loneliness, now sleeping side by side. Because sometimes all we need to carry on is knowing someone will never leave us behind. For 3 days, a little boy vanished deep within the forest. No one believed he could survive, not through the cold, not through the nights. But then, out of the shadows, a gaunt German shepherd emerged, his fur matted, his breath shallow, dragging behind him a thin trail of blood, and a truth that would leave the entire town in stunned silence. No one knew where he came from. No one could explain how he had known exactly where the boy had fallen. Morning in Grayson Hollow arrived with the soft gold of an autumn not yet ready to fade. The mist moving like silk through vine-covered fences and weathered porches still damp from last night's dew. The brick homes nestled along the hillside remained in slumber, while the town square began to stir, filled with the scent of cinnamon, baked apples, and the familiar hum of festival season echoing from speakers strapped to crooked lampposts. Amber pennant flags fluttered lazily in the breeze, and above, the sky wore a wash of pale blue streaked with white, like beaten egg whites catching slanted sunlight. Clara Rowan held her son's hand as they walked through the main street, closed off for the Golden Leaf Festival. The boy's hand was warm, his tiny fingers curled tightly around hers, as though afraid the crowd might somehow carry him away. Luca looked up, his wide brown eyes round like chestnuts, gleaming with curiosity and the kind of joy only found in the hearts of children finally free to roam. His hair, tousled and soft, peeked out beneath the hand-knit beanie Clara had finished just in time for the celebration. This was the first year Luca had been strong enough to attend from beginning to end. His winter asthma had receded for now, and Clara came prepared, an inhaler tucked into her bag, warm water in a thermos, and carefully mapped out distances between each booth. Dr. Ilara Quinn had suggested more fresh air, more walking, and if possible, let him wander a little. Let the heart find its own rhythm. From the wooden stage in front of the town hall, a local band began playing Rustling Leaves, the delicate notes of a violin drifting upward, threading through the crisp wind like the memory of autumns long gone. Children burst into laughter, chasing colored bubbles near the caramel apple stand where old Mr. Beckwith, in his threadbare coat, entertained with sleight of hand. Grown-ups stood beneath maples, steaming cider cups in hand. Beneath an ancient oak, Mrs. Nellie gathered a cluster of wide-eyed kids, her voice painting tales of the forest watcher, a ghost who once saved a child from floodwaters and vanished, leaving behind only paw prints and a wooden comb nestled in moss. Clara only half listened, but Luca. Luca heard every word. He tilted his head toward the voice, his eyes aglow, as though he could already see that forest in his mind. Trees that whispered, footsteps that never echoed. "Mama, if the ghost is real, is he like a person?" Luca's voice was soft, scratchy from the cold, but clear, like a wooden flute played by trembling hands. Clara smiled, crouched to fix his scarf. "Maybe not like a person, but maybe like what you're imagining. Gentle, and someone who keeps promises." Luca nodded solemnly, then gasped as a paper kite shaped like a hawk soared overhead. A gust of wind caught it, lifting it higher, sending it careening toward the misty tree line that marked the beginning of Silver Pine Woods. The kite didn't fall. It climbed, dipped, then darted away, as if daring someone to follow. Luca let go of her hand. Without warning, he slipped through the crowd, weaving past a stand selling pumpkin pies, too fast for Clara to react. He darted through the square, past the statue of Mayor Harold Granger frozen in eternal salute, and beyond the makeshift fence separating the town from the forest trail. The kite floated ahead, its string catching briefly on a chestnut branch before snapping free, continuing deeper into the wild. Dry maple leaves spun at his feet. He didn't see them. His gaze remained locked on the shadow dancing above, a secret game between boy and wind. Behind him, voices began to rise. First one, then three, then a whole chorus of panicked calls. But Luca had already crossed into the path of reddish dirt, past the thinning border of pine trunks, into the place where sunlight broke in slivers, and the air thickened with resin and damp earth. The wind shifted. The festival music, once so close, faded into a faint blur. Trumpets, laughter, loudspeakers dissolving into the mist like breath on glass. Luca paused in a clearing, his palm pressing against the spot on his chest where his inhaler rested in his coat pocket. He didn't wheeze, but each breath felt heavier. He turned, searching for the kite, but it had vanished into the gray. Something moved at the edge of the trees. Not a person, not the kite, a low form, gliding over leaves with cautious grace, silent and earthbound. It watched him. Not a predator, not a threat, but with eyes that knew. Luca didn't feel afraid. There was something familiar in that gaze. From behind, voices drew closer. A shout, his name, this time from his father, Darren, rough and hoarse with panic even he didn't recognize. Luca blinked, half-turned, then stopped, as if some part of him knew this moment needed to last longer. The creature stayed rooted, lit from the side as sunlight cut through the trees and struck its eyes. It didn't advance, it didn't retreat, it waited, watching, guarding. A second gust of wind blew through, tousling Luca's hair and sending a shiver down his spine. But he didn't run, and whatever passed silently between them in that gaze ensured this meeting would not vanish without a trace. As the hurried footsteps of an adult drew nearer, the shadow of that creature vanished behind the thick trunk of a densely leaved tree. And what remained, between the fading mist and the maple forest, turning its colors to the hues of autumn, was a footprint deeply pressed into the damp earth, large, heavy, and etched with the clarity of each curved claw. The second gust of wind swept through, tangling Luca's hair and sending a slight shiver down his spine. But he did not look away. And something in the way his eyes held that moment, wordless yet full, seemed to decide that this encounter would not be allowed to dissolve into silence. As the hurried footsteps of an adult drew closer, the creature's silhouette disappeared behind the dense foliage. Left behind, among the drifting mist and the maple trees blushing into crimson and gold, was a footprint sunken deep into the moist soil, broad, weighty, and so clear that even the arcs of its claws seemed drawn with deliberate intention. Luca moved forward, slowly, toward the print, his small hand brushing aside the wet, flattened grass. He knelt down, placed his palm beside the impression, then lifted his fingers to his face, where the water clinging to his skin still held the chill of dew resting on leaves before dawn. A breath escaped his chest. Soft, not from exhaustion, but from the dawning of a feeling too vast for him to name, as though the forest had been holding a story close to its heart, and he had, by some quiet accident, turned to the very first page. And then, the sky changed. The first sign was the shift in the wind's direction. Then came the rustle of leaves, not gentle anymore, but restless and abrupt. Clouds gathered swiftly, swallowing the last streak of light from the sky, and the silver pine woods no longer wore the warm gold of a festival's glow, but sank into a deepening shade of gray. The kind of gray that spoke not of a rain to come, but a rain already present in the air. One drop, then two, then hundreds, like shattered dust from a distant rooftop, falling through the canopy, bursting against leaves and splattering into the gray-stained soil. Luca tilted his face upward, his fingertips grazing his cheek. The rain was cold, sudden, without warning. He turned to retrace his steps, but the grass was now slick, and the forest floor had been overtaken by crisscrossing shadows of twisted trees. The wind scattered all sense of direction, and within moments, Luca could no longer tell which way led back. His breath quickened. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his inhaler, but the hurried motion knocked the cap loose, sending it into the mud. He bent down to retrieve it, his knees sinking into the wet ground, water seeping into his shoes. In the scramble, he slipped. His small frame tumbled down a sloped patch of earth, rolled past a rocky outcrop, and landed with a thud in a shallow hollow lined with moss. His head struck the edge of a stone, not enough to bleed, but enough to daze him. He lay still. Above him, the rain drummed wildly on the canopy in disjointed rhythms. The cold crept beneath his collar, his small hands curled inward. A minute passed, then two, then three. No one called his name. No voices broke the quiet. Only the forest breathed. And the sound of his heart, beating inside a damp chest, weary and clinging to a rhythm that felt more fragile with every passing second. Then, another sound emerged. Footsteps, faint but weighted, enough to shift the nearby leaves with a gentle rustle. Not too close, not too far. The steps did not carry the tension of a predator, nor the panic of something fleeing. They felt like a careful probing, deliberate, as though some creature were listening to the rhythm of the earth with its own souls. Luca opened his eyes. From the thickets beyond, past the screen of rain and the patchy shadows of swaying branches, a dark figure slid out from the obscurity. Slow, steady, and utterly silent. A dog. Not a domestic one. No leash, no colorful scarf, no soft traces of pet-like presence. Its coat was deep black, streaked with patches of yellowed fur and caked with mud. Its back arched slightly, ears alert, standing high in a hush of caution. Its gait was low to the ground, ribs faintly visible beneath wet skin. Around its neck was a torn leather collar, a dull metal tag worn smooth, with dried blood crusted along one edge. Its golden eyes met the boy's, unblinking, unsnarling, unspeaking. That gaze did not come from wild instinct, but from a place that had once known orders, known pain, known disorientation, and still, even now, chose to move toward the one trembling the most. The wind cut sideways, tilting the rain. Ranger did not flinch. The dog stepped slowly toward the hollow, where Luca lay shivering, his hand still clutching the inhaler he hadn't yet opened. Ranger did not touch him, only stood there, blocking the wind, then lowered himself gently beside the opening, turning his back to the forest, eyes scanning every twitching branch. The scent of him was strong with soil and old blood, and something in that soaked coat seemed to dull the cold sweeping across Luca's body. The boy reached out, his fingers grazing the thick fur, not out of instruction, but because his heart told him to. Ranger did not react, but his eyes blinked once for the first time. The rain kept falling, and night fell swiftly. High above, the leaves still trembled gently, like a delicate veil filtering the boundary between darkness and breath. Ranger shifted his body, pressing closer to the rocky ledge, forming a barrier against the creeping cold that threatened to slip in through every crack. Luca nestled in closer, his small hand resting against Ranger's neck, feeling the coarse patches of skin and the steady, unhurried rhythm of a heartbeat. Unfazed, unbroken. A flash of lightning rippled through the distant sky, casting a violet-white glow across the forest, illuminating the long scar running along Ranger's flank. A scar neither new nor fully healed, like a fragment of memory still searching for a way out of the night. But Luca wasn't afraid. To his eyes, it wasn't a wound. It was the mark of someone who had dared to walk through places most never returned from, and still chose to come back, exactly when it mattered most. The rain began to ease, the mist thickened, and in that damp, hushed space, Luca's breath mingled with the warmth of the strange dog, forming a shared pulse of life, not loud, not bold, but steadfast in its quiet insistence on staying. Above them, through the canopy of trembling leaves, a sliver of night sky began to open. A single star emerged through a break in the silver clouds, small but unmistakable. And in that brief moment, Ranger lifted his head and gazed upward, as if receiving a signal from some distant place that only he could understand. Luca slowly closed his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't ask. But his hand remained, gently pressed against Ranger's neck. Somewhere not far from the forest, the first search team whistle broke through the silence, echoing off the cliffs, spreading like a wave, then faded at the edge of a silhouette, a dark figure lying still on wet stone, unmoving, eyes fixed on the direction of the wind. Back in the southern operations room of Warren County, a red light blinked furiously beside the emergency signal monitor. At exactly 11:14 p.m., the internal phone rang 3 short times before cutting off, followed by a female voice, rapid but composed, speaking through the receiver. "We need Lieutenant Rowan on site, immediately. His son has been reported missing since this afternoon, Silver Pine Forest. We require his presence within 45 minutes. At that time, Darren Rowan was sitting alone at shooting range 7, behind the main field, a place he often drifted to after drills ended, not for duty, but to fill the silence that followed. At his feet stood an M4A1 balanced upright on its stand, and on his left wrist hung the old watch of his father. A battle-worn man who once told him, "Being a father isn't just being there when your son is born. It's keeping your word when you've been gone too long." Darren heard every word, but his focus caught on one. Son. Luca. That name hadn't echoed in his heart for some time, not because he had forgotten, but because he no longer dared to speak it. No one teaches a father how to find his way back when the bridge has already collapsed under the weight of too many fights, too many silences, and finally, a divorce. Neither side wanted, but both signed. He left the base less than 10 minutes later. The road to Grayson Hollow twisted beneath a curtain of rain, washing the outlines of pine ridges into streaks, leaving trails of fog clinging to the windshield. Street signs slid past like torn pieces of memory. Beacon Street, where Luca first learned to ride a bike. Hollow Bridge, where he and Clara had once whispered possible names for the baby that hadn't yet arrived. every lamppost flickering by sliced across his face like fragments of a past he had never been able to piece back together. When he turned into the town square, the festival lights still glowed, but their sounds were gone. No more music, no more open stalls. Only a few figures huddled under the awning of Mrs. Edna's bakery, and an ambulance parked without sirens, without urgency, as if it were waiting, not for news, but for something that might change everything. Darren stepped out, his boots landing with a slow, heavy sound on the wet bricks. He didn't need to ask. One glance at Clara, seated on the steps of the old post office, told him more than any report could. A thin blanket draped over her knees, and her hands gripped Luca's beanie as if clinging to his heartbeat through every knitted loop of yarn. She looked up. She saw him. There were no greetings, no blame. Just a single quiet nod, barely enough to say, "You're here." Darren sat beside her, the space between them barely a breath. His eyes scanned the hood of a nearby vehicle, where the forest map had been unrolled. Red circles, broken black marker lines, and the name LUCA printed in slanted block letters. Did he have his meds with him?" Darren asked quietly. Clara nodded, her voice soft, uncertain. "Yes, but if the rain got in, the inhaler might be damp." Darren clenched his jaw. His hands tightened, the cold biting through the fabric and anchoring into bone. A search team member approached, reflective vest soaked at the collar, voice careful but clear. "We found small footprints near the edge of Silver Pine, but it's dark now. The terrain there is slick, risk of landslides. We'll need you to confirm some personal items, and if there's anything you remember about his behavior, something specific we can use for the model, we'll integrate it." Darren nodded. But he didn't know what music Luca liked these days. Didn't know if he was still drawing like he had when he was 5. But he remembered. Once, in kindergarten, Luca had hidden a tiny wooden bird in his backpack. Because it flew the wrong way, and I wanted to teach it how to find home again. And somehow, that one memory was enough to make Darren look toward the forest, toward the trembling trees and the slant of wind. And no, if there was something holding Luca close within those woods, it was something that had chosen to stay with him, whether man or not. That night, Darren entered the forest with only a flashlight in hand, walking alongside the rescue team but never taking a seat in their vehicles, never donning the military uniform still folded in his closet, bringing with him instead a small fabric pouch slung lightly over one shoulder. A pouch that held not survival gear, nor maps from command, but a handful of objects once beloved by his son. An orange plastic harmonica dulled at the edges, a pair of fuzzy mittens that still carried the scent of cedar drawers, and a piece of crumpled paper, faded from years but kept whole, where his son had drawn a map at the age of 6, with a red marker scribble in the bottom left corner that simply read, "Dad, if you get lost, call my name, okay?" The deeper he went, the colder the forest became. Not with the bite of frost or the lash of wind as he had expected, but with a stillness that settled into his skin, where the air turned thick and the sky above dissolved into a color like milk stirred with honey, light and indistinct. The flashlight in his grip barely pierced the darkness for more than a few meters ahead. But it was enough. Enough to illuminate the grass that had been split at the roots, the branches that had snapped at unnatural angles, and a few muddy trails that had not yet dried. By the time he reached the 3rd incline, Darren paused. He crouched, sifted gently through the damp leaves with fingers grown clumsy from cold and grief, and lifted a small object half sunken in rot and earth, a dislodged inhaler cap, intact but smeared with mud. He held it between 2 fingers, delicately, with the reverence of someone who feared that too much force might cause everything that had not yet broken to finally come undone. Ahead, a sound emerged, not loud, not urgent, merely the wind brushing against the trunk of a tree, then folding back on itself, as though breathing in and out with a purpose. Darren took a few more steps, and when the beam of his light swept across a clearing at the edge of a rockfall, he stopped. His heart surged, not with fear, but with the trembling ache of recognition, because on the far side of the slope, it felt as if the forest had begun to open, not with a cry, not with a sign, but with a silence so profound that even a father who had once lost the rhythm of his own heart could still hear the only thing left worth believing in. The light dipped toward the earth, landing on a patch of slick ground where a footprint sat embedded in the mud. Strange in shape, not quite human, but no longer entirely wild. Darren knelt, pressed his hand gently to the imprint, felt the coldness seep into his skin. Far beyond, just past the ridge, less than 3 miles from where Darren now crouched, Ranger still lay close beside Luca. The rain had ceased, but mist clung stubbornly to every hollow, weaving through the roots and stones and hanging thick in the air like a veil spun from the breath of the ground itself. The moisture gathered at the edge of mossy banks, forming a pale, ghostly sheen under the dim moonlight that had only now begun to pierce through the thinning clouds. And in that stillness, still as a lake just after its last ripple has died, there was only the gentle breath of a lean, watchful dog, his body curled protectively around the frail warmth of the sleeping child. Luca remained asleep, his breathing shallow but steady. Ranger turned his head, eyes fixed on the boy, not with panic, not with haste, but with a kind of internal compass, unlearned and unshaken, as though something inside him had always known the way. His tongue flicked once at the hem of Luca's coat, where the rain had soaked through to the lining. The mingled scent of child's skin, earth, and the faint metallic trace of medicine hung in the air, and Ranger tilted his head, listening longer than he usually would. He rose, careful not to stir the silence, and padded a few steps toward a narrow stream trickling from a nearby crack in the rock. It was no more than a ribbon of water, too thin to sing, but still clear enough to catch the light, forming a soft silver trail like a ribbon drawn across stone. Ranger drank a few quiet gulps, then lifted his head, ears suddenly sharp, catching a soft sound from where Luca lay. Not a call, just a small cough in sleep, a flutter of sound before the even rhythm resumed. And then instinct stirred, the kind that never left him. Ranger scanned the clearing. Beneath a twisted root, he found a half-decayed branch, tugged it free with his teeth, then gently chewed until the bark began to peel. With movements rooted in old muscle memory, he gathered several broad leaves that had not fully rotted and selected a smooth, flat stone. There was no fire, not anymore, but the memory of fire remained. The echo of soldiers crouching in dark bivouacs, of kindling crackling under whispered watch rotations, of warmth spreading in rings across the night. He did not light a flame, but he placed the dry branch beside the child's body, close enough to hold the heat of his own, then lay down once more, positioned between Luca and the wind, his thin body serving as shield and furnace both. The chill did not bite the same way now. Ranger's body had adapted, pressed close to a space once filled only with damp and cold. And then, as the forest settled into a slower rhythm, something deeper stirred inside Ranger. Something old, something buried. A sound that did not belong to this place. Gunfire, screams, a man's voice shouting through beams of military floodlight, and blood, hot, wet, then cold in a matter of heartbeats, spraying across his forelegs. He did not remember all the faces, But he remembered the command. Eliminate all targets, no survivors. Engage if minors are present. It was that order that had split him in two, that had left his paws rooted between tents, one echoing with gunfire, the other with the cry of a child. And it was his choice that shattered everything. He did not charge as he had been trained. He turned. He bit through the cord securing the tent. He let the child escape. He blocked the path. The soldier who followed him fell. And by nightfall, an invisible sentence had already been passed. Uncontrollable, remove from unit. No one asked why, no one needed an explanation. He was transferred. 3 units, no files kept, no name retained. And eventually he vanished. Without tags, without records. All that remained was a warped metal plate hanging loosely from his neck, hand-etched with a string of numbers, P12-079. He no longer knew how far he had traveled, only that every time he heard a child cry, his paws stopped. Every time the scent of medicine drifted from a shallow breath, his heart beat louder. And this time, when he stepped through Silverpine, when he saw Luca's shape crumpled in rain and stone, his body moved before thought could catch it. It wasn't because of a command. It wasn't because of training. It was because of something far deeper, something that needed no translation, something that lived beyond words and drills. If this boy vanished, the world would lose a beat it was never meant to skip. Ranger shifted again, pressing closer against the boy's side, his body forming a shield against the cold that crept into the rocks. His tongue brushed gently against the child's icy wrist. A silent awakening, warm and instinctive, the kind only a creature who had once gone years without being touched could learn to offer. The boy stirred. His lips moved without sound. But his hand reached out, found the coarse fur, and held on, not to pull away, but to stay. The moon passed overhead. The rain had stopped completely. High above, the last droplets fell from the trees, tapping like soft knocks into the silence. And in the stillness of that forest frame, Ranger lifted his head once more, peering through the break in the leaves toward a thinning sky. A sound, faint, distant, carried on the stones. It wasn't a growl. It was a whisper, the echo of someone calling a name, far away, but still full of hope. At Grayson Medical Center, the hallway lights had been dimmed from their usual glare, now casting a warm, pale yellow glow across the aging wooden walls. Clara sat on a moss-green metal chair outside the on-call room, her hands clutching a fleece blanket she had meant to wrap around her son. Mud still clung to her boots, and her jacket sleeves had gone cold from dragging the ground. The nearby glass door stood slightly ajar, letting in a breath of pine resin and old rain clinging to the bones of the town. She hadn't cried. Not yet. Every time her eyes began to blur, she gripped the blanket tighter, her nails digging into the fabric, as if pressing pain into something physical could keep the wave from cresting over her chest. Clara had once believed herself strong. When the marriage fractured, she had braced herself to be mother, friend, and temporary father all in one. She hadn't blamed Darren for walking away, for his stubbornness, for the silences that stretched too long, or for the hollow space he left in parent-teacher conferences and nights when Luca's asthma flared and the only chest he could lean on was hers. But tonight, when the call came and the words, "Your son is missing," reached her ears, the first emotion wasn't fear. It was guilt, sharp and slow like a wound that never fully closed. Why didn't I hold his hand tighter? Why did I let him chase a kite? Why did I look away for just that 1 second? Clara turned these questions over and over in her mind. Unanswered, unanswerable, as if blame could be a balm for the growing weight that pressed against every hour that passed. The soft sound of wooden heels echoed from the end of the corridor. Dr. Elara Quinn appeared, her beige coat slightly creased, her hair tied back neatly, a steaming cup of herbal tea in her hand. Her face carried the weariness of long hours, but her eyes still held that quiet steadiness no textbook could ever teach. A gaze forged from watching too much pain linger just beyond reach. She set the cup gently on the small wooden table beside Clara, without speaking right away. Clara looked up, and in the eyes that no longer had the strength to scream, Elara saw something she'd seen before, in many mothers. It wasn't despair. It was an emptiness where belief used to live, cracked and waiting for something new to hold on to. "I once knew another child who got lost," Elara said, her voice soft like late-season rain. 7 years ago, near the edge of the forest. But he wasn't alone. Clara lifted her eyes, a frown beginning to form. Elara rested a hand on the chair rail, her gaze fixed on the glass door where the mist had now blurred all sense of distance. "Something brought him back to the tree line before the search team arrived," she continued. "It didn't run. It didn't let anyone near. But it stood there, between the child and the rest of the forest. No barking, no growling, no retreat." Clara held her breath. The pulse at her wrist slowed for a moment. "A dog?" she whispered. Elara nodded. "A German shepherd. Some said he was abandoned after a military mission. Others claimed he had once been trained at the K9 facility in the Southern District, Unit P12. But the files were deleted when that special ops program shut down." "His name?" Clara asked, barely above a whisper. "No one dared call him by one. The letters on his tag were too worn to read. But the children he saved, they called him one thing: Ranger." The name cut through the stillness between them like a sharp breath in cold air. Clara's fingers closed tighter around the blanket, her gaze falling inward into the emptiness that now stirred, an emptiness that had just begun to take shape, to pulse, to suggest something that wasn't clarity, but wasn't nothing either. "Do you believe it?" Elara asked quietly, not as a challenge, but as a bridge. Clara didn't answer right away. She looked down into her open palms, where the blanket still lay, absorbing the rising warmth from the untouched cup beside her. A faint beige patch began to spread across the fabric, like morning light filtering through a window. Gentle, slow, and full of promise after a sleepless night. "I don't need to believe in anything too grand," she whispered, her voice carrying the soft finality of someone who had long since traded hope for something quieter, something more survivable. "I just need to know that if someone is out there with my child, they know how to keep a child warm." Elara nodded gently, placing her hand upon the woman's shoulder, like a silent rest in a melody that had been broken too many times to ever be played the same again. Outside the window, the fog began to thin, retreating in slow wisps, as if the dawn had whispered something it could not ignore. Small flecks of light shimmered from the scattered oil lanterns strung across the distant houses, forming faint halos that hovered like fallen constellations resting on the earth's quiet skin. The search horn sounded again, this time longer, steadier, less like a cry of desperation, and more like a call to return, a reminder that not all who wander are truly lost. Clara rose, tightening the scarf around her neck with both hands, then stepped through the door. Her silhouette stretched long across the damp brick path, her shadow bound to her by a choice that had not been spoken aloud, but had already taken form somewhere deep within the stillness of her bones. At the foot of the hill, a figure was emerging from the edge of the forest, and somewhere in the space between light and shadow, a sound, barely there, like the soft exhale of a creature that did not speak the language of humans, brushed against the senses of anyone still capable of listening. In the damp hollow, blanketed by rotting leaves and thick moss, the first breath of morning slipped into the world as a sliver of light wove its way through the uppermost canopy, threading gold through branches like the hand of something older than time itself. The sun was not yet warm enough to touch the ground, but it was enough to cause the mist to shimmer, to catch on every dew-laced thread like a net drawn across the forest's pulse. Ranger opened his eyes first. It was always that way. Not because of an unfamiliar sound, not because of threat, but because the instincts of something once trained to live within the fragile spaces between heartbeats had never dulled. He turned his head slowly, watching the child beside him. Luca, sleeping on his side, one hand resting on Ranger's back as if the night had never passed, as if his grip had never loosened. Luca stirred. His eyes blinked open, sluggish from sleep, his face traced with dried earth and a faint red mark across his cheek, perhaps from stone, perhaps from cold. But the gaze he gave Ranger held no fear. It held something far closer to recognition. He sat up slowly, swiped a hand across his face, and braced himself on one palm. His breath was shallow, but not panicked. He looked around, once, then twice, before returning his eyes to the German shepherd standing still as a breathing stone. "You really stayed?" he asked, his voice hoarse with the remnants of fog still caught in his throat. Ranger did not move, but his tail tapped the ground. Once. Only once. Luca smiled. It was the first smile since he'd gone missing. He reached out, fingers brushing the battered metal tag dangling from Ranger's torn collar. The letters were blurred, the edges jagged, and the old scars etched over the numbers made them unreadable. But on the far right side of the tag, there was a narrow gash, as if from a knife, splitting the metal into two uneven halves. Beneath the cold plate, there was skin. And there, a scar. Ranger lowered his head at the boy's touch. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. "Were you a forest guard?" Luca asked softly, eyes still fixed on the mark. "Maybe you used to protect the woods, and someone hurt you?" There was no answer, but it was that very silence that became a kind of language the boy somehow understood. "Then, I'll call you Ranger from now on," he said, nodding to himself, as though naming didn't require permission. "Forest Keeper." Ranger lifted his head. His eyes caught the first beam of sunlight as it sliced through the leaves, casting gold across the damp ground in a way that made it shimmer like a promise, not made with words, but with presence. It was not the first time he had been given a name, but it was the first time that name came without command, without reward, without threat. It was simply a name. Small, warm, and born in the middle of a silver forest, spoken with no purpose other than the quiet desire to call someone a companion. They began walking as soon as the sun touched their shoulders. Ranger moved ahead, not rushing, never straying too far. Each step was measured, deliberate, as though a map of the silver pine forest lived inside him, not as lines on paper, but as memory woven into muscle, the hidden paths, the soft earth that turned to swamp after rain, the old creek beds that once sang and now whispered only to those who had listened long enough. Luca followed behind, gripping a small branch to push aside leaves. The fatigue was still visible on his face, in the lines around his eyes, but his steps did not falter. He trusted Ranger, not because he had reason, not because he had proof, but because he simply believed Ranger knew the way. And the feeling of being led, of not walking blindly through shadow, made him feel a little less lost than he had the night before. Past two moss-covered boulders, Ranger halted. He lowered his nose, sniffed at a patch of grass recently trampled, then turned sharply, leading Luca southeast, toward the remnants of an old ranger station abandoned 3 years earlier after a minor forest fire. By midday, they reached the edge of a clearing, marked by half-rotten stakes and the skeletal remains of what had once been walls. The roof was long gone. Only 4 broken columns and a splintered corner of a table remained. But beneath the decaying floorboards, hidden under a layer of earth and leaves, there was a shallow cavity. Ranger pawed at the foliage, nudged the edge with his teeth, and pulled out a dented tin can. Luca sat down, hands trembling slightly as he worked the lid open. There was nothing fresh inside, but there was a bit of dry biscuit, a smear of old butter, and a sealed pouch of purified water. Untouched, and for a child who had been lost, and a dog who had survived places few had ever dared to follow, it was enough. It was, in every quiet sense of the word, a feast. Luca broke the bread in half, offering the first piece to Ranger, who accepted without sound. The boy then uncapped the water pouch, took a few measured sips, and sat back against the nearest tree trunk, his gaze fixed on the derelict station ahead. No longer just a ruin, but a place that, to his eyes, might once have been someone's shelter, someone's forgotten home, left behind by time. "Did you used to live here?" Luca asked, not seeking an answer, but more as a whisper into the stillness. Ranger didn't respond, but his eyes shifted toward a crumbled corner of the brickwork where faint white letters had been painted long ago. Emergency channel, frequency 82.4. Something in the dog's stare drew Luca forward. The boy stepped closer, reached out, and traced his fingers over the writing, his eyes widening. He recognized the code. In survival class, the instructor had once explained that some abandoned ranger outposts still held emergency radios. If one could find the trigger, the signal might stretch across several miles. He turned back to Ranger, hand clenched at his side, eyes suddenly brighter. "We're going there, right?" he asked in a hush. Ranger lowered his head slightly, then moved forward, nose to the ground. It wasn't a nod. It wasn't refusal. It was movement. Intentional, certain. Not wandering anymore. Now there was a direction. The wind picked up again, brushing through the high canopy in a slow whisper, like the voices of the ancient forest itself, bearing witness to the countless beings who had come and gone, and still remembering, holding on to something unchanged. Footprints that needed no compass, no path, only the memory of a scar not yet healed to find their way home. On the old dirt trail, Ranger paused briefly, looked over his shoulder at Luca, and in that breath of stillness beneath the leaning trees, a shaft of golden light broke through ahead, forming not a straight trail, not a clear one, but enough of an opening to believe that something waited at the end. Perhaps even the first signal ready to break its silence after all these years. The signal room lay hidden behind a line of fractured rocks, not half a mile from the old ranger station, cloaked beneath dead vines and thick lichen that covered its concrete shell like a skin of time. No one had stepped foot there since the fire, when flames swept across the southeastern edge of Silverpine and burned the main power relay to ruin. Luca approached the rusted iron door, his fingers brushing the layer of fine dust on its surface, feeling the faint thrum beneath. Like a pulse long silenced, but never truly gone. Ranger stepped forward and nudged the door with his shoulder. It creaked open by inches, exhaling a burst of air from within, cold and breathless, like something that had waited too long to be remembered. There was no musty scent. Only the clean, dry smell of old stone and steel forgotten. Inside, the remnants of function still clung to the walls. A control panel, fractured light indicators, a folded mini antenna tucked against the ceiling, and a Midland radio unit, dangling by a corroded steel cord, its casing bruised by time. Luca stepped in, wiped away a layer of dust with his sleeve, then turned to Ranger as if to ask, "Will this work?" The dog didn't move, but his eyes locked onto the transmitter and didn't look away. Luca knelt down, opened the service panel near the floor, and searched for the emergency release switch. Exactly where the instructor once said it would be. A lever that, if pulled hard enough, could jolt the backup system into life, provided any energy remained. He pulled. Nothing. He pulled again, and this time there was a click, dry and metallic. A thin light above flickered red, then shifted into a weak but living green. The signal was stirring. Not strong, not clear, but alive. Luca reached for the microphone, pressed the transmission button, and spoke, his voice trembling with more than cold. "My name is Luca. Rowan. I'm lost. I'm near the old ranger station, by the big rock field. There's a dog. He's watching over me. We need help." His voice rose and then dissolved into static, soft, steady, unresolved. He tried again, slower this time, enunciating each word, holding the button longer, speaking not to the silence but through it, as if his words could push through the forest, cross mountains, drift past dead towers, and find the one person still listening. Ranger remained near the doorway, still. But suddenly, his ears lifted, stiff, alert. The ridge of fur down his spine rose with tension. It wasn't the machine, it wasn't the wind. It was a sound, faint and deliberate, touching the edge of the forest behind the room. Not the sound of a rescue team. No voices, no flashlights, no hurried boots. Only a presence, moving with intention, but leaving no trace. Ranger let out a low growl in his throat, just enough for Luca to turn and stop transmitting. "What is it?" the boy asked softly, his hand tightening around the transmitter. Ranger didn't answer. He backed up, pressed his body near the doorframe, eyes locked on the forest's edge. The wind wasn't strong, but it carried a scent, metallic, earthy, something that did not belong to the wild. The dog stepped outside, nose lifted to taste the air. Luca followed, his hand instinctively gripping the edge of Ranger's coat like he had done since last night, like a lifeline. And then, through the stillness, a breeze skimmed the ground. A twig snapped, sharp and small, and from the deepest part of the brush a flicker of silver flashed beneath the sun, not from stone, not from water, but from the cold, calculated reflection of a lens, one affixed to a head, watching. Ranger growled, a deep, thunderous sound that did not ask, did not plead, and carried none of the upward lilt of a call. It was not a signal for help. It was a warning. Luca flinched. He couldn't see anyone, but he could hear it, that unmistakable swift rustle gliding through the underbrush like breath through teeth, footsteps retreating, fast and quiet, the way only a person moves when they've been seen but not caught. The boy trembled, but he didn't scream. Ranger did not chase. He remained exactly where he was, his frame blocking Luca without touching him, eyes fixed on the spot where that glint of reflected light had vanished. One paw dragged softly across the dirt, an instinctive motion of caution, not yet aggression, like the tightening of a bowstring just shy of release. "Not a good person, right?" Luca whispered, voice low, uncertain. Ranger didn't move, didn't blink. He didn't have to. No bark, no nod, no need. No dog stands like that unless the figure in the woods isn't lost. But hunting. Both of them backed into the ranger station, slow, deliberate, not running but aware that speed wouldn't help if what followed meant harm. Luca pushed the door shut, slid the bolt into place with trembling fingers, then crossed the room toward the small, aged transmitter. He pressed the button again, his voice steadier than his hands. "Please, If anyone's listening, there's someone out there. They're not part of the rescue team. We're being followed." The signal blinked red, this time slower, dimmer, the power source draining with every pulse. Luca bowed his head. He looked at Ranger but asked no more questions. The dog turned his head, and for a fleeting second his gaze caught his own reflection in the warped metal plate nailed to the opposite wall. The distorted image capturing the two of them merged into one silhouette beneath the soft, flickering glow. In that room, there was a silence so complete that even the wind chose to pass around it rather than through. And somewhere beyond those walls, the man who had passed through the forest now stood beneath the thick arm of an ancient tree, unmoving. In his hand, a handheld signal scanner pulsed gently, a faint green light blinking with slow precision. Lock confirmed on transmission frequency 82.4. He didn't hurry, and Ranger, from behind the wall, still stared unblinking toward that presence, as if every muscle, every breath within him was sketching a map of danger not made of roads or coordinates, but from a feeling in the bones, a memory buried too deep for language, yet too sharp to forget. Agent Kessler stood shrouded beneath the tree's shadow, his black weatherproof jacket blending seamlessly with the bark behind him, gloved hands leaving no trace on wood or stone, and his face partially obscured by a tactical half-mask that hid everything but the eyes. Two pale points of light that did not reflect but consumed, drawing in every flicker of movement around him with unnatural calm. He didn't need a topographical map. He carried something far more precise, the identification signal of a biological asset encoded as NT-Z43, a serial designation used exclusively for K9 units in Aegis Dynamics semi-autonomous enforcement systems, creatures bred, trained, catalogued, and ultimately decommissioned when they no longer served intended operational utility. Every move Ranger made, every breath, sent out microbursts of low-frequency pulses, not enough to be picked up by satellite, but enough for short-range receivers to detect the distinctive waveform signature of a unit gone off-pattern. Kessler had followed that broken signal for 36 hours, across 2 secured zones, 3 dense forest systems, and 1 defunct logistics station at the base of Echo Ridge. But now, finally, there was no ambiguity. Ranger, or rather, P12-079, was inside a 300-meter radius, moving slow, signal intermittent, behaving like a malfunctioning unit, still clinging to its spatial orientation programming. There was no need to engage. Not yet. Kessler stepped back into the darkness behind the tree, withdrew a compact, encrypted transmitter from the breast pocket of his jacket, tapped the screen, and recorded a short command in a voice cold and exact. Target P12-079 confirmed, signal fixed at 82.4, accompanied by 1 unknown life form, minor. Maintain protocol GRAYNULL. Action directive, retrieve if stabilizable, erase trace if risk of leak. He didn't sign it. Just transmitted the clip, returned the device to his chest pocket, and began moving again. Each step calibrated to avoid broken branches, each movement designed to leave no vibration behind, no disturbance in the shallow resonance field around him. Inside the ruined ranger post, Ranger still hadn't looked away. His ears twitched with every slight shift in the breeze, his nose tightening as he drew in the air that now carried traces foreign to the forest's native breath. Chlorine, industrial paint, the iron of steel filed down until its scent nearly vanished. Luca sat beside the transmitter, arms exhausted, eyes red from squinting at the flickering signal light. But his voice, though worn, remained clear. "Please, this is Luca Rowan. Is anyone there? We need help." No one answered. Only static, followed by silence, like a forgotten station on an old frequency, still waiting patiently for someone who once promised to return. Ranger stepped closer, placing his head gently atop the boy's hand, a touch so quiet it felt like a breath. And in that gesture was something unspoken, but clear. "You've called. Now listen." Luca looked up, and for the first time since the ordeal began, his eyes did not shine with fear or fatigue, but with a fleeting glint of trust, fragile and instinctive, directed wholly toward the creature standing before him. A dog with no proper name, no collar of belonging, no one who brought him there, and yet who was now leading him, one steady step at a time, away from the edge of despair. At the forest's edge, Kessler continued to move. He raised a scope, scanning the low canopy. At first it was only branches, rock, and moss, and then a shape shifted dark against the trees. Ranger. He adjusted the lens, and then he saw the child. Luca stood there, leaning against the tree trunk, his small hand gripping the coarse fur around Ranger's neck, his eyes scanning the horizon as if he already sensed he was being watched, though he couldn't yet tell from where. The man exhaled, quietly. Not regret, just calculation. He adjusted the focus once more. He didn't raise his weapon, didn't draw a blade. Instead, he planted a small, black, cylindrical device into the soil, sharp at one end, unmarked at the other, then pressed a button. A low-range impulse wave surged outward, silent, undetectable, but enough to skim the biostructure and trigger the dormant neural imprint left inside the grafted system. Ranger jolted. His body stiffened, as though caught in the pull of an invisible leash. His eyes, once clear as still water, dulled for a heartbeat, like a curtain of cold steel had dropped across his gaze without warning. His spine arched, muscles clenched. Breathing accelerated into a pattern born not of instinct but of command. Luca noticed it instantly. He wrapped his arms around the dog's head. "Ranger, what's happening?" The boy gasped, his voice sharp with fear, his small hand stroking Ranger's throat, heart pounding beneath his ribs. Ranger resisted the growl rising in his chest, teeth clenched. A low rasp escaped his throat. But in that moment, his eyes cleared. Not with obedience, but with choice. And then, in one sudden movement, Ranger turned and leapt from the signal room, not to escape, but to confront. Luca called after him, but didn't follow, because somehow he knew. There was something Ranger had to face, something he had to finish, before he could return to the path, to the boy, not as a weapon, but as one who keeps his word. In the thinning mist of the forest, Kessler remained where he stood, his hand still resting on the emitter. But this time, his eyes faltered, because what he saw was not a creature breaking, but one turning back, each step steady, each breath searing with memory that refused to stay buried. And between these two beings, once forged in the same program, trained by the same hand, sent through the same simulations, only one still carried an unbroken pulse, capable of choosing who to love. The other, a function left to erase. Beneath the rustling canopy, shaped now by a wind that carried a new direction, Ranger's steps made no sound. But with every inch drawn closer, Kessler instinctively withdrew the device and checked its sync, because the signal marked P12-079 was no longer broadcasting a clean frequency. It had mutated. It was free, and that was the one thing the system was never built to permit. Above, a narrow cloud broke, spilling a shaft of pale gold onto Ranger's shoulder. A lean figure, scarred, weathered but unbroken. And from behind, a voice, young, steady, not loud, not rushed, but ringing just enough to reach across the distance. "Ranger, I'm waiting." As night fell across the rim of Silverpine, the cold crept in without sound, threading through crevices in stone, hollow roots, and the underbellies of dew-soaked leaves, not with screams, not with warning, but with the kind of quiet persistence that always seeks out the weakest places to settle. Inside a shallow grove, temporarily sheltered by gathered dry leaves and broken branches, Luca curled into himself. His breaths came shorter now, his chest rising unevenly, rhythm spiraling beyond pattern. He had spoken too much, run too far after Ranger into the forest, returned alone to the signal room when the frequency began to flicker. And when the last rays of daylight faded, the asthma he had fought so long to hold back began to claw its way out, its first signs hiding in those dry little coughs he didn't want Ranger to hear. But Ranger knew, not through language, not through training, but through the subtle difference in how Luca's hand trembled when resting on his back. Softer now, weaker, no longer gripping with the surety of the night before. Ranger pressed close to the boy's chest, body curled like a wall against the wind. He lowered his head, gently resting his brow against the boy's neck, exhaling warm breath into the thin fabric, trying to trade heat, comfort, whatever still remained. That breath carried the scent of earth, of pine, and of something else, something only Ranger carried now. The smell of a creature who had crawled through trenches, endured commands traded for casualties, never turned back when comrades fell, and had once asked himself why he was left to live. And in that fragile moment, between the wind outside and the labored coughs rising in Luca's throat, Ranger closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. There were no full images, just flashes, red lights blinking through dust and haze, a man in uniform collapsing on a stone incline, blood soaking through his chest. Ranger had been there, had tried to pull him to cover, but the bullet came too fast. That man's hand had rested on Ranger's neck before the light faded from his eyes. And in that last moment, the man whispered a few words, brief, broken, meant for no one but the one who had stayed. "Don't let... next time." And that had been the last time Ranger was called comrade. This time Luca wasn't a soldier, didn't know how to fight, didn't know how to dodge. He was only a child, with a breath fading fast, a trembling hand still clutching the inhaler that had fallen somewhere along the path and now refused to activate from damp and decay. And in that silence, between a memory and a life slipping toward it, Ranger knew there would be no next time to lose. Ranger licked Luca's forehead once, slowly, then nudged himself deeper into the fold of the jacket the boy had draped over himself for warmth. The heat radiating from the dog's body was steady, unwavering, like a living hearth burning low and constant, without flicker, without fade. Luca struggled to breathe. Every inhale dragged water to his eyes, but behind the tears, in the trembling gaze that searched the dark for anything still solid, there remained a flicker of light, small, fragile, and trembling, but still burning. And within that breath, Ranger found no fear. Only trust, delicate, surviving, and placed entirely in him. He licked the boy's lips again, gently, as if to assure him he was still here. Then lowered his head, placing it over the child's chest, guarding the heartbeat beneath like a vow that didn't need to be spoken aloud to exist. The moon rose higher. The wind softened, curling like silk around tree limbs. Pale light filtered through the broken canopy, painting a silver shimmer across Ranger's thick fur where he lay completely still, like a stone that had learned to breathe. And somewhere deep in the forest's heart, one star began to burn brighter than the others, as if something, however faint, had just been preserved. By the time morning came again, Darren had walked past more than 60 marked coordinates, each one notated on his map in red ink, scribbled by the unsteady hand of a father who never imagined he'd need to use his old tracking skills in the very town where his son grew up. The search teams had split into trios, combing sections of terrain in practiced rhythm. But Darren had chosen to go alone, not out of protest or protocol, but because he knew there were silences. Only he was tuned enough to hear. The shift of a pebble nudged by a small foot, the scratch of moss disturbed by a creature that didn't wear shoes. At the southern edge of Silver Pine Forest, where morning sunlight pierced the foliage in sharp, slanted beams, he found a patch of disturbed earth. Prints overlapped, frantic, chaotic. He knelt, pulled off one glove, and pressed his fingers to the damp soil. Buried in the rot of leaves and the clinging moss was something that caught the light. Not dew, not stone, but metal. A collar. Crushed and half-buried, its leather strap torn at the seam, as though ripped away from the neck of the creature that had once worn it. Darren picked it up, lifted it to his face, wiped away the mud with the edge of his jacket sleeve, and as the hand-etched numbers began to reveal themselves through the grime, he froze. P12-079. Not a soldier's number. A biological tag, the kind issued to K9 units in the experimental warfare programs, units assigned to the off-the-books black modules where names were irrelevant and survival was conditional. And P12, he remembered, had belonged to an unsanctioned training project, a temporary deployment hidden in the Grayson Forest nearly 8 years ago before it was shut down for failing to meet minimum ethical criteria. He clenched the collar in his fist, holding it like a fragment of memory someone had tried hard to erase, one he had not forgotten. Because Darren, during a rotation back in training, had once heard that designation crackle through a private channel. P12-079, stability compromised, retrieval requested. And after that, nothing. No updates, no reports, no records, as though Ranger had never existed at all. But this collar, battered, torn, marked but not erased, was the one remaining piece that reminded Darren. Something had survived. Something had slipped the numbers. And it was still moving through the forest like a living rebuttal to silence. He turned, slipped the collar into his inner coat pocket, and without pause retrieved his encrypted comms device. The signal was weak, but from the slope near the abandoned relay point, he managed to catch a stable enough band to transmit. "I need to speak with Mayor Granger, this morning. Send a vehicle to the eastern base slope. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Mayor Silas Granger sat behind his desk, hands loosely folded, his gaze fixed on the dust-softened window where the morning light poured across the old tea set passed down from his grandmother, an heirloom from the days when Grayson Hollow was still a logging town carved into the edges of unrecorded forest. Darren entered without ceremony. He laid the collar on the desk. "You served on the Regional Military Advisory Board. I need you to tell me exactly what the K9 Project P12 in Grayson Forest really was, and why the files were purged from the system." Granger didn't answer at once. He sat still, lifting the collar into his palm, turning it over as if trying to view it not in the light above the desk, but through the grainy lens of a memory he had long kept sealed. "You know better than anyone," he said finally, voice low. "There are things left out of the record not because they were wrong, but because it wasn't yet the right time to say they were right." Darren's eyes didn't leave his. He didn't blink. "If someone's tracking Ranger now, they're not coming to retrieve him. They'll erase him. And this time, it's not just the dog who'll disappear. There's a child with him." Granger exhaled, a sound caught halfway between resignation and dread. He reached into the locked drawer behind his desk, retrieved an old keyring, and opened a dual-lock filing case set flush into the wall. From it, he pulled a large sealed envelope, unlabeled save for a single handwritten phrase, "To be handled only if anyone survived." He laid it before Darren. Inside is everything I managed to keep before the facility was destroyed. There are behavioral logs, training records, psychological notes from the last vet who worked with him. What was the vet's name? Ilara Quinn. Darren didn't react with surprise. He nodded once, took the envelope, and as the morning sun broke across the edge of the table and lit the faded etching on the collar's surface, he saw, for the briefest instant, what the last decade of redacted files and rewritten reports had tried to erase. Ranger P12-079 had not vanished. He was still alive, still guarding, still fulfilling something no command had ordered, no handler had reinforced. And if a dog once trained to operate without a heart could now preserve another life through nothing but breath, then everything else was worth placing a bet on. By the time Darren stepped out of the mayor's office, fingers clenched tightly around the folder, the sun had already risen high over the roofs of Grayson Hollow, casting sharp beams that illuminated drifting specks of dust in the air, as if even the sky itself were waiting to see who would uncover the truth hidden behind fading lines of forgotten ink. At the northern edge of the old ranger station, where eroded soil overlapped the dead roots of fallen trees and leaves had compacted under years of silence, 3 electromagnetic emitters had been buried beneath the ground. Each device was tuned to disrupt low-band civil frequencies, warp navigation signals, and interfere with biosystems embedded with reactive code that responded to temperature-based neural prompts. Agent Kessler didn't need many. 3 points, 3 vectors converging to create a pressure field just strong enough to throw off orientation, not to force the creature out for its own sake, but to force it into the open because of the one walking beside it. Luca. The boy crouched behind a large rock, no more than 40 paces from the signal room. Ranger had sensed the shift in the air the moment it happened. He stopped. Nose lifted. Scanning, ears twitching, eyes deep and taut like the surface of water moments before it breaks. Tiny spasms rippled through the muscles along his spine, too subtle to see, but present. Like an old instinct awakened, not out of reflex, but from something scarred so deep it became part of the tissue itself. Luca didn't understand why Ranger suddenly froze. He hadn't yet learned to recognize the scent of heavy ozone. He didn't yet know that certain frequencies made dogs ache behind the eyes, shiver behind the ribs. But he saw it. Ranger pulling back, growling low, not as threat, not as defiance, but as a warning. "We're not going that way?" Luca whispered, hand gripping the back of Ranger's coat. Ranger turned. His gaze paused on the boy's face, then shifted just beyond, a silver glint flashing from the underbrush, a fraction of metal uncoated and too precise to belong to anything natural. No hesitation. Ranger lunged sideways, shoving Luca to the ground and throwing his body over him. And at that exact moment, a sound sliced through the wind. A sharp hiss, not long, not slow, but precise enough to carve the direction of the air into something that smelled like blood. The bullet found its mark. It struck Ranger's left flank, tore through muscle, split skin, not bone, but left behind a strip of heat like fire ripping through silence, staggering the dog mid-stride. Luca screamed, eyes wide, fingers trembling as crimson began to seep through the thick fur, like the color of sunset falling onto a bed of untouched snow. But Ranger didn't fall. He let out a growl, louder this time, rising like a thunderclap from deep beneath the forest floor. Not to intimidate, but to declare, "I am still standing." Teeth clenched, breath ragged, he spun, not towards the shooter, but around, forcing Luca to move with him, steering him away from the interference zone. He led the boy through narrow saplings, skirting exposed ground, brushing past the edge of a landslide path, finally halting near the forest's fringe, where light trickled in between fractured limbs. Far behind, Kessler kept his hand on the trigger. He didn't fire again. He was observing, waiting, to witness what earlier reports had dismissed. Behavior beyond programming. He pulled out a device, entered the biometric code. P12-079 deviated, vital signs fluctuating. Blood pressure not dropping, no conditioned defensive response. Instead, a rise in heart rate, synced to the proximity of a living organism nearby. It meant the subject was moving in response to emotion. Kessler's brow furrowed. He had never seen a creature learn to protect what it was never taught to value. Behind the boulder, Luca panted, pressing both palms against Ranger's bleeding side. He didn't know how to dress a wound. He only knew to hold, to apply pressure, to whisper, "Please, don't leave me." Ranger never looked away from the trees. But he lowered his head, touched his nose to the boy's forehead, and drew in a long, deep breath, as if to memorize the scent of a life he could not afford to let disappear. Above them, the sky had turned a soft gray. Clouds thickened from the western edge. The wind had shifted. Ranger glanced up. Time was running out. But to the east, where the high rock ridge stood beside the old outpost, there was still a way. If he could get Luca there, if they reached the summit before full dark, there would be signal. There would be someone. He bit gently into the boy's sleeve. Pulled. "You want me to go?" Luca asked, eyes red and glassy. Ranger nodded. Once. The boy didn't cry, didn't argue. He took hold of the dog's collar, leaned into the blood-wet body, and together they moved, toward the final ray of light spilling between the crags. No more words were spoken, but every step forward was a silent promise, deeper than any vow. At the small medical office on the eastern edge of Grayson Hollow, Dr. Elara Quinn opened the third drawer of an old wooden cabinet, its surface faded by time and worn down by decades of quiet truths no one had dared to speak aloud. Beneath the amber glow of the desk lamp, her hand moved carefully, brushing aside a fine layer of dust that clung to each folder like memory, untouched but never entirely forgotten. Tucked into the far corner of the drawer, behind a file marked AR-1920 regarding neuroresponse conditioning in working dogs, was an envelope. Sealed, yellowed at the edges, but the adhesive still intact. On its surface, written in green pencil with quiet urgency, were the words, K9-P12/Special, do not destroy without biological confirmation. Elara sat down. Her heartbeat quickened, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that the moment her fingers touched the lip of that envelope, she would be stepping back into a place she had once turned away from, a place where, 10 years ago, a silent decision had left her carrying the burden of two truths, that of a doctor and that of a witness. Inside was a thick dossier, clipped together by a rusted fastener, each page watermarked with the word confidential, faded but unmistakable. She opened the first page, K9P12079, internal codename, Ranger primary functions, pursuit, biometric targeting, tactical obedience, target elimination via DNA index match incident report, March 14th, XXXX. Subject failed to execute order. Refused pursuit of adolescent target within conflict zone. Suspected emotional override. Behavior classified non-compliant. Deactivate trigger code. Recommend termination. Protocol G-R-A-Y N-TUN. N-U-L-L. Elara closed her eyes, placing a hand over the page as if it were living skin. One still bruised, still scraped, still bearing the marks of defiance that no one had ever dared to articulate. She turned to the next page. Her own report, filed nearly a decade earlier. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, though someone had drawn a red slash across it, erasing its authority without erasing the truth. Subject K9, P12079, exhibits anomalous response to Level 4 kill directives. Biofeedback shows a sudden spike in gamma waves, typically only present in species with long-term emotional bonding. Recommend reevaluation of behavior classification. Do not terminate. Do not retrieve. Subject requires time for natural bioemotional recovery. Elara Quinn, Special Medical Advisor to Unit P12. Stamped over the bottom, Proposal rejected. Storage extension denied. She remembered the moment she had printed that report, one copy only, before it was purged from the electronic archive. She had known then what she still knew now. Anything stored digitally could be erased. But what was printed, held, breathed on, remembered, that could live on. Elara rose, walked to the locked cabinet at the back of the room, retrieved a small wooden box, and opened it. Inside lay an old handheld biometric reader, the type issued during the earliest days of the trial program. She inserted the battery, powered it on, and entered the access code, 079. The screen blinked. A flickering biosignature appeared, unclear, incomplete, but unmistakable. Status: active emotional response. Index: abnormally high last pulse. Location: Silver Pine, frequency conflict zone 82.4, unauthorized activity detected. She tightened her grip on the reader. She knew someone was tracking him. She knew there were those who had long since decided that Ranger was not a subject, but a malfunction, a glitch that needed to be cleaned up. But she also knew that if she did nothing now, the entirety of the project, everything those creatures had endured, would be buried beneath a single word: error. She picked up the phone and dialed the internal line. A male voice answered. Darren Rowan. "Where are you?" she asked, without greeting. "I just got back from the eastern resupply point. Found another small print near the stone clearing. Blood. I think it's Rangers." "Do you have an old energy grid map of the forest perimeter?" "I do, but mine's outdated before the signal tower got dismantled." "That's fine. I have a biometric scanner for P12-079, and I don't think we have much time left." "I'm listening," Darren replied, without hesitation. Elara connected the device to the station terminal. The screen filled with data: heart rate spikes, gamma waves not seen since the program's final year, and a warning glowing red at the top. "Unstable variant. Displays protective behavior toward human subject." And in that moment, she no longer saw Ranger as a failed unit. She saw him as a choice. A creature who had once defied the order to kill a child, and who now, years later, was spilling his own blood to keep another child alive. She packed the device, gathered the files, and placed everything carefully into her bag. She slipped on her coat, opened the clinic door, and stepped out into the late afternoon light. The sun filtered softly through the trees, casting an amber slant across her shoulders, stretching her shadow down the path like a thread pulled taut between what had been and what now must be. She did not walk quickly, but each step, each breath, carried with it something rising, not rage, not fear, but responsibility. And in the east of the forest, where the wind began to spiral and fold upon itself, a dog stood still upon a mist-veiled slope, eyes lifted toward the sky, as if waiting for someone, at long last, to step out of the shadows and whisper, "I believe in you." Ranger's back twitched once as his shoulder grazed the damp earth along the trail that led out of the forest. His lean frame, soaked in sweat and blood, drained by the incline and the distance, finally tilted to the side like a beam of wood whose core had long since been burned out, held upright only by the final threads of sheer will. Yet his eyes remained open, focused forward, watching the boy who was still running, gasping, never looking back. Luca didn't look over his shoulder. Not because he forgot, but because he believed Ranger would still be there, still guarding his back, just like every time before. The old signal whistle, once worn by his mother when Luca was just a toddler, now rested in his trembling palm. He lifted it to his lips and blew. Not loud, not fast, but with just enough breath to let the sound slip past the leaves, over the dew-heavy hollows of the forest, and into the low-hanging clouds above the ridgeline. The sound wasn't high, wasn't long, but it carried like a silent cry for help, like the first spark of fire lit after 3 nights adrift in a world with no faces, no names. And then, from a corner of the sky, something began to move. Not with roar, not with urgency, but like a thread of hope slowly drawing a new line across the horizon. Luca looked up, hand still wrapped tightly around the whistle, his eyes glistening with a blend of mist and something he couldn't yet name. He stepped back, toward Ranger, and only then did he see the dog had collapsed completely. Beneath the dark fur, a fresh stream of blood traced a slow arc from rib to shoulder blade. The bullet, perhaps, had torn deeper than they thought, ripping through muscle, severing something vital. Ranger did not whimper, did not flinch, but the boy could see. The chest still moved. Slightly, softly, like the breath of the old forest itself, right before morning breaks. Luca knelt, pressing his forehead to Ranger's. No words, no panic, just presence. A boy wanting the dog to know. He was here. From the distant edge of the tree line, a figure approached, slowly, methodically, the way predators close in when their prey is already too weak to run. Dust-coated black jacket, tactical boots that made no sound. On his shoulder, a sniper rifle with a suppressor, eyes locked not on the boy, but on the dog, and on the device in his hand, where a blinking green light confirmed. Target no longer moving. Agent Kessler halted behind a broken pine trunk and tapped his earpiece. Position confirmed. Target motionless, awaiting final directive. Only a single word returned, dry and flat. Okay. Then silence. Kessler raised his eyes, finally, to the boy. And something slowed. The child sat beside the dog, hands clutching the whistle, gaze steady, not afraid, not accusing, but holding something that made the man hesitate for just a breath, as if he had seen those eyes somewhere before. In a black and white photo, maybe. In a classified file labeled K9P12. A boy, skinny, curly-haired, holding onto a dog standing between him and a wall of rubble, back during a campaign long buried by time. And that dog was the one lying here now. Kessler drew his sidearm. Light, controlled. But his hand didn't rise, because from afar, a low hum sliced toward the canopy. A rescue chopper. The boy had gotten through. Kessler took one step back, eyes still fixed on Ranger, torn between 2 orders, complete the mission, or vanish before too many eyes saw what was never meant to exist. At the same time, from the opposite direction of the forest, Darren was running, tracking the last signal ping from Ilara's device. His flashlight cut through the bramble, scanning for movement. He had already spotted the blood trail and heard the message from the rescue team. And as he emerged near the clearing, the beam of his light struck the dark silhouette ahead. Kessler turned. Darren raised his weapon, not to fire, but to make clear. One more step, and that's too far. The helicopter's roar grew louder, blades churning the mist that poured down from the hillside above. Ranger remained still, but his ears twitched, just slightly, as if he could hear. The rotors, the engine, and the footsteps getting closer. Luca stood, moved in front of Ranger, arms outstretched. Darren shouted, "Clear the area!" But Luca didn't move. No one told him to stand there, but he knew. This dog had come this far, had shielded him from bullets, had led him from darkness into breath. And now, if there was anything he could do to save that life, it was simply to stay still. The wind surged through the forest like a great exhale from the earth itself, bending the trees and breaking the silence, just as the helicopter's rotors cut through the fog, casting down a beam of light that carved a clearing through the mist. A luminous platform, suspended mid-air, like the threshold of a dream just beginning to dissolve into waking. Kessler turned, reached inside his coat, and drew something small, not a weapon, but a signal dampener, along with a pair of data chips, the kind designed to override free response, to return Ranger to a status once filed as controlled asset. But as his gaze landed for what might be the final time on the wounded creature, on a dog clinging to life as though it were the last scrap of belief left in the world, he slipped everything back into his pocket and retreated into the forest. Without a sound. Behind him, Ranger opened his eyes just once, not toward the man who had vanished into the shadows, but toward the boy, Luca, who was now leaning in, pressing his cheek gently to the dog's brow once more, whispering as softly as breath can carry, "We're almost out." The forest did not answer, but the sky, after so many days of holding its breath, opened just enough to show a patch of unbroken blue, cloudless and clean. And the light that fell onto the boy and the thin, battered dog beside him was not just sunlight. It was acknowledgement. It was permission. It was something being kept. The smell of antiseptic bit at the air, sharp and sterile, curling around the slanted rays of late light filtering through the window of room 12 on the third floor of St. Helena Hospital, where the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors and the soft scuff of rubber soles on cold tile had become the ambient soundtrack to homecomings that were never quite whole. Luca opened his eyes. The brightness stung, forcing his lashes to flutter before settling on the ceiling above, white-gray, blank, unmovable. No forest canopy, no sky, only the strange stillness of displacement. But it wasn't the light, nor the scent that made his heart seize. It was the absence of warmth. The sudden, icy emptiness beside his arm where something strong and living had once rested. He lurched upright, but his body was still too weak. His arms, thin and pale, struggled to push the blanket aside, reaching, searching for fur, for breath, for the low growl that once guarded him through sleep. But there was no Ranger. "Where is he?" The words broke from his chest before permission could catch them, too full of urgency to wait for explanation, too real to disguise. The door opened. A doctor in a white coat stepped in, but before she could speak, Luca was already twisting to slide off the bed, the IV line pulling taut with a sharp hiss. A nurse rushed forward to hold him back, but the moment she met Luca's eyes, wet, defiant, aching, she hesitated. "I promised him," Luca said, voice cracking. "I promised I wouldn't leave him." He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The words rippled through the room like an echo through cloth, folding past the curtains, seeping into the hallway, where footsteps stilled and heads turned. His hand clenched around the hand of the woman sitting beside him, his mother, and his gaze, brimming with a child's desperation and a survivor's clarity, found the one adult he knew had once believed in him, without question. "Please, Mom, don't let them take Ranger." Ilara didn't answer immediately. Her hand trembled inside his, and in that moment she was no longer a doctor, no longer the composed adult called to respond with logic and protocol. She was just a mother who had watched her child crawl back from the edge of silence, and who now feared losing the one being who had carried him through it. "Sweetheart, Ranger needs to be examined. They're not taking him. They're just—" They don't understand, Mom. If they touch the chip inside him, if they scan him wrong, Ranger will think he's in danger. He'll think he has to run. And this time, he won't wait." Each word fell like a shard, glinting with truth, too sharp not to cut those who heard. An older nurse stepped in quietly, placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder, and whispered, "They're moving the dog into quarantine. A civilian tactical team arrived. They say they need to assess abnormal biological data." Ilara stood up. Her eyes no longer held concern for data or procedure, only life, not a specimen, not a malfunction, but a living being, a soul, that had once chosen to shield a child instead of obey the command to end one. "I'm going with them." "They won't allow entry into quarantine," the nurse replied, almost pleading. "I'm not asking." Her voice wasn't raised, wasn't sharp, but it held the finality of a door locking shut behind the truth. The room fell still. Luca was eased back onto the bed, his fingers still clutching the makeshift collar he had removed from Ranger's neck the night they first met. His eyes followed his mother as she stepped out of the room, not crying, but breathing in that thin, uncertain rhythm that felt like placing every last fragment of belief he had into the echo of her retreating footsteps. Ilara walked through the hospital's east wing, past corridors washed in the soft gold of evening, past windows blurred with age and doors left half open, past rooms where patients rested, unaware that beneath their floor, in a chamber sealed by 3 sets of locks, beneath the bone-white glow of fluorescent light that hummed with indifferent precision, there, a dog was waiting. And not just waiting, remembering. Inside that room, Ranger did not growl, did not resist. He simply stood, still silent, his gaze fixed on the doorway as though counting each slow-turning second in anticipation of what might come next. Not from the dark forest this time, but from the very place that should have offered safety. And from the far end of the hallway, where the final light of the day brushed against the stone floor, footsteps approached. Not hurried, not hesitant, but with the steady rhythm of someone answering a call for help. Not from a patient, but from a young survivor who had kept a promise at the edge between life and loss. And in that moment, inside room 12, where the afternoon sunlight stretched softly across a white pillow, Luca tilted his head and whispered again, not to anyone in particular, but into the space itself. "I promised, and I know. You will keep yours too." Beyond the Grayson Ridge Mountains, in a wooden-paneled room inside a decommissioned military outpost, no longer listed on any active map, an older man sat before a worn, cornered map, his hand resting lightly on a yellowed photo. One of a young soldier standing beside a German shepherd, both facing the camera, not smiling, not posing, only gazing forward with the kind of clarity that time cannot erase. Colonel Thorne still kept that photo. When Darren entered, the colonel didn't turn around, but he tapped the edge of the desk 3 times, an old battlefield habit, his way of signaling that he was listening, and that the next words should be direct. Darren placed a thick file, over 200 pages, on the desk, worn by decisions that had altered the lives of uniformed men, and of 4-legged beings who were never named in any official record. "I didn't come here to ask for mercy." Thorne nodded once, slowly. "I know. But Ranger, he's no longer an escaped unit. He didn't kill, he chose not to. And if that choice is called betrayal, then maybe we've been asking the wrong questions from the start." There was no hum of an air conditioner, no soft whir from idle computers, only the sound of the wind brushing against the window frame, and the angle of evening light slanting through the blinds, drawing long shadows across the wood grain, as if nature itself had paused to listen. Thorne remained silent, eyes never leaving the old photograph. "Do you know why Ranger was selected for K9P12? Darren shook his head. He was fast, strong, accurate. Thorne gave a dry laugh without sound. Number because he didn't react by the book, because in chaos, he still chose. Against the flow. We thought we could program that out. But we forgot. Dogs weren't born to be tools, especially not the ones like Ranger. He opened a drawer, pulled out a sealed envelope, and from within it, a document with a faded seal and bolded heading. Subject P12-RG07, recommended for erasure from official system. He placed the paper aside, then pulled out a pen and a fresh sheet of paper. No words spoken, only writing. The letters weren't graceful, but they were steady and clear. Each stroke sank into the paper like a step retraced toward light, after years of believing only shadows and orders could hold things in place. Ranger, P12RG07. Status honorably retired. Reason, moral bravery in field. The final line was underlined by hand, not for emphasis, but like a quiet gesture of apology for a loyalty once misunderstood, once hunted, and now finally restored to its rightful shape. Darren took the paper, but didn't leave. I still don't understand why you trust him. After everything. Thorne looked up, his gaze no longer that of a man who gave orders, but of someone who had once survived because of a being who spoke no words, yet understood what hundreds of men might forget. Because some stories only loyal dogs know how to tell the truth of. That afternoon, Darren returned to Saint. Helena with a document that had never existed in the protocols of any military branch. It was laminated thinly, carefully, sealed in an envelope the color of sand. When he entered the hospital hallway, Ilara was standing beside her son's bed. Luca wasn't asleep yet, but his eyes lit up when he saw the envelope in Darren's hand. "What's that, mister?" Darren sat down and gently placed his hand over Ranger's chest, the dog lying quietly, head resting against the foot of the bed, eyes half closed but still alert to every movement around him. "It's his retirement papers. He's retiring?" Darren smiled softly. Not because he's old, but because he was brave. At the exact moment no one had to teach him how. Luca placed his hand into his mother's, squeezing gently. That morning, the clouds drifted slowly over the Rowan rooftop, a rare rhythm, as though the sky itself was cautiously returning to a house that had once been shut tight, only letting in light through one faded curtain. The car pulled up in front of the porch. No horn, no rush, just a stillness so gentle you could hear the sparrows land on the wire outside the gate. The door opened, and Ranger stepped out. No leash, no command. He placed both front paws down on the gravel at once, stood still for 3 seconds, as if listening, to the breath of the land beneath him, where old footprints remained, where dried blood had once stained stone, where dreams had been interrupted, and where a child had once looked at him without a flicker of fear. Ranger walked onto the porch, no stairs, no tension. He simply crossed the threshold as if he had never left, as if he had never been labeled by a number, never been shot, never carried the weight of a kill order written in code. Only as someone who had come home. Luca sat in the chair by the window, his legs still gently bandaged, his left wrist moving only in slow arcs, but the clarity in his gaze outshone every pane of glass in the house. Ranger walked over. He didn't bark. He simply lay down beside the chair, his body folding into place like it had always belonged there. And when Luca suddenly coughed, a soft, short cough, Ranger's tail gave a single gentle wag, then paused. The second time Luca coughed, the tail moved again. A reflex, not taught. And it was that reflex Clara noticed. The woman who had always kept her distance from anything unpredictable stood up this time. She didn't speak. She didn't ask Darren. She didn't wait for anyone to nod. She stepped closer to Ranger, then knelt. One hand reached out, touching gently along his back. Her fingers landed right on the scar-streaked fur, where a bullet had once sliced through flesh, and for the first time, not to examine or assess, but simply to feel whether the skin beneath still carried warmth. "Thank you for keeping your word." The words weren't loud, they didn't thunder, but they struck something inside Luca as if a door had just closed, and at the same time, another opened. Outside, the trees began to sway gently. The scent of pine wood, damp earth, and the faint trace of antiseptic from inside the house merged into something nameless, but unmistakable to anyone who had ever survived, ever waited, ever held on to belief despite all verdicts and redacted files. Ranger remained still, but his eyes turned to the yard, where the old hammock Rowan used to sit and read was still swaying slightly, as if no one had ever abandoned it. A breeze swept across Clara's hand. She didn't pull away. And far down the dirt road behind the house, a white butterfly touched the ground once before lifting, like the air itself had just let go of something unnamed that everyone had been carrying. Behind them, Rowan was preparing lunch. His hands were steady, but he knew. If he heard just one more soft sweep of a tail across the floor, it would be enough to call this place by a name long forgotten, whose pronunciation had slipped from every tongue, but was remembered in every heart. Home. That afternoon, the sky softened faster than usual. The sun no longer blazed. It spread instead like warm honey across the low forest, painting a quiet shape on the back wall of the shed. The shape of a dog lying still, head resting on the ground, eyes open yet not focused on anything specific. Beside Ranger, the old biscuit tin had been placed carefully, its lid slightly ajar, as if someone had tried to close it with a hand still too weak, or had left it deliberately unsealed, so whoever opened it wouldn't need to struggle. Ranger didn't open the tin, he didn't touch it. He just lay there, his breath lightly brushing its surface as if trying to keep warm something that didn't belong to him alone. Inside the tin, a small sheet of paper had been folded into thirds. The ink was fresh, still carrying the scent of ballpoint pen mingled with vanilla crumbs and broken cookie bits. "To Ranger, I know you can't read this, but I wanted to say it. Thank you for choosing me instead of fear. I'll learn to be someone like you. And if one day you ever need someone to keep a promise, I swear, I'll be that person." The handwriting wasn't even. Some words were misspelled, then crossed out, but not erased, as if Luca had wanted to preserve even the imperfections, believing the truest things were never about being right, but about being brave enough to be written down at all. And Ranger, a being once known only by code, once sent into forbidden zones, once left lying beneath the rain with eyes wide open, was now lying beside a biscuit tin in a corner of the yard roofed with pine slats and wrapped in trailing vines like a quiet, invisible lifeline. The wind passed through Clara's drying laundry, lifting the scent of clean fabric and mixing it with soil still damp from watering. Somewhere in the distance, an old accordion played from the neighbor's porch. An old tune, played without a single wrong note. Luca didn't come down. He stood at the window, fingers curled around the wooden frame, his eyes not following any person, but watching the very thing he had just done. Darren stood beside him, meaning to ask, but falling silent. He followed Luca's line of sight, and in that same moment their eyes landed on the exact spot where Ranger lay, his head slightly tilted, as if quietly watching over the space surrounding the small tin box. No name was called, no command was given. But the air, the way one dog had chosen stillness over escape, and one child had chosen to write instead of staying silent, had already created something indefinable, yet instantly recognizable to anyone who had ever lost their way. The root of trust. Hours later, as the sun slipped behind the trees, the light shifted to amber, spilling gently over Ranger's back, where the fur that once bore a long wound had now grown evenly, leaving only a faint line, like a pencil mark drawn across a musical score. Clara stepped out into the yard, a bowl of water in one hand and a few crumbling scraps of stewed chicken in the other. She didn't call out. She simply set them down, then sat on the edge of the porch steps, her eyes drifting toward the low grove at the far end of the yard, where the treetops swayed gently in the late breeze. Ranger didn't leave the crate, but his tail gave a quiet thump against the floor. Once, slow and deliberate, when Clara sat down, not with haste, not with insistence, but as if to say, "I know you're here. And I haven't left." Rowan came out last, carrying something small in both hands, a splintered piece of table leg reshaped into a six-pointed star. At its center, lightly carved with a pocket knife, were the words, "Where there is choice, there is freedom." And as night began to lower itself gently over the rooftops, stretching the long shadows until they clung like quiet guardians to every wall, Ranger remained beside the biscuit tin, untouched, unmoving, not for what it held, but for what it meant. That sometimes the most valuable thing wasn't what waited inside, but who chose to wait beside it. High above, the first star pierced the sky, positioned precisely in the direction of the eastern tree line, just beyond the crate, where, by tomorrow, Luca would return with something to add. Perhaps his first student ID card, or maybe the Silver Whistle Ranger had once followed through wind and rain. That year, the Golden Leaf Festival arrived earlier than it ever had. Autumn winds threaded through the narrow streets, carrying the scent of baked apples and the chiming of bells from the schoolyard at Grayson. Fallen leaves formed thick carpets under the feet of neatly lined children, each one wearing a white and blue ribbon around their wrist, while on the wooden stage built in the heart of the town square, Luca stood tall, holding the honor ribbon now looped around Ranger's neck, a glinting silver band embroidered with just 3 golden words: "The Promise Keeper." Ranger wore nothing else, no medals, no pins, no decorations. But as Luca climbed the steps and stood in the row of honored students and decorated veterans, every gaze turned toward the dog, not for what he looked like, but for what he had done and what he continued to do, standing beside the boy who once couldn't speak and helping turn him into someone the whole town now followed. Mayor Granger sat in the front row, gently squeezing his wife's hand, as Luca's voice rang clear through the microphone. This year, the title of Grayson's guardian does not go to a person. It goes to a creature who taught us how to keep a promise without speaking, how to protect by staying still, how to remain awake even while lying down. In the audience, people rose to their feet, not with applause, not with noise, but simply stood, as though honoring a ritual never written, but long awaited. Golden leaves fell along the hallway of the old school building, right where Ranger had once lain while Luca, still healing from his head injury, took his first tentative steps again. And just there, a few days prior, a group of second graders had placed a small handmade statue, shaped from clay and cardboard, of a dog lying sideways, eyes open. Ranger knew nothing of the statue. But that afternoon, he happened to pause there, sat quietly, then tapped his tail against the floor, once, and continued walking. At Miss Daly's bakery, a photo of Ranger sitting with the marching band now hung in a wooden frame near the register, and every customer who passed through would eventually hear her say, "He's not a service dog. Ranger is the last guardian who still chose love over orders." At the old hospital, the hallway where Luca once collapsed from fever had been renamed the Hall of the Kept Promise. A brass plaque had been installed, engraved in soft, glowing letters. A life that bows at the right moment is a life that teaches us to rise forever. On weekends, Rowan repaired the fence behind Ranger's pen. He didn't speak much, just nailed a small hand-lettered sign into the gate, sealed in a plastic sleeve, that read, "Please knock, the gatekeeper is off duty." And Clara, who had once measured each step near Ranger with quiet suspicion, now placed a clean cloth in his water bowl every morning, along with a slice of peeled apple. Small gestures not of apology, but of understanding, as if to say that some presences do not require explanation, only recognition. On the final afternoon of the season, the sunlight filtered through the low windows of Grayson Hollow, scattering down each porch step like golden threads, warm and quiet as the smile of someone watching from afar, never entering, but always present. Luca stepped out the back door, holding an unopened envelope from a children's rescue training academy, a letter inviting him as a candidate for internship. He hadn't read it yet. Ranger stood nearby, head tilted, his gaze still and clear like the surface of a lake undisturbed by time. Luca didn't speak. He simply held the letter in front of him, then set it gently down by Ranger's paw. No nod, no bark, just a small motion of the tail, barely a flick, but enough for Luca to understand that every path forward begins with something old, something quiet, something simple. A trust kept in silence. A late leaf slipped from the tree above, landing on Luca's shoulder, then drifting softly down the line of Ranger's back. And at the end of Grayson's main street, where the first street lamp blinked to life, a group of children began to hang lanterns. One of them paused, turned, and looked toward the house with the oakwood porch, where a dog stood watch, not barking, not pacing, but with eyes brighter than any light they would hang that night.